must go and think on this. He paused. May I go to the Godswood? You may, father sighed. And if you have any further dreams, please let us know, Theon. Especially of heart trees or the old gods. Much rides on this. More than you might think. Theon drew himself up and nodded formally to them all, before walking out, closing the door behind him. Well, father said eventually, that was something of a shock, was it not? It was, Robb replied thoughtfully. In my memories Theon never gave any signs of any such dream, nor was he marked like that. This is, well, new. But is that a good thing or a bad thing? Mother asked thoughtfully. Good. Father said forcefully. We are changing what happened. And in the case of Theon, well, the old gods have touched him. Changed him perhaps. We must see what happens with him. I do not yet trust him, but if the old gods have touched him, I must think on this. There was a knock on the door of the solar and father looked over at it. Enter. The door opened to reveal Maester Lewin, who was escorting the ancient Maester Aemon. Our father said quietly. Maestus. Thank you for coming. Robb, could you please find Jon and ask him to come here? We have something to discuss with him. Chapter 4. Chapter text. Jon Snow. He liked sitting the Godswood in front of the Heart's Tree. It was quiet, peaceful, still. He could pray in the morning and then return to think about life in general. So he'd been rather surprised to discover Theon Greyjoy sitting in front of the Heart's Tree that morning. Very surprised indeed. The squid was just staring at the tree with a look that combined astonishment, confusion and deep uncertainty. They traded looks for a moment, before Greyjoy nodded slightly at him and then stood and wandered away. Jon watched him go with a slight frown. Something was wrong with that squid. He didn't know what it was, but he was sure that father and Robb knew what it was. He considered the matter from as many angles as possible for a moment and then he shrugged and bent his head in prayer. When he lifted his head again he saw Robb standing quietly to one side. Father needs to see you at once, he said quietly. In his solar. Jon nodded silently and then walked off. He'd had a feeling that something was wrong for these past few days. Something had been hanging in the air, something had been unsaid by father whenever they had met, he knew it. When he got to father's solar he was surprised though. Lady Catelyn was standing at the window and turned to give him a strained smile. And Maester Aemon was sitting by the side of father's desk, which was laden with books and papers about the old gods and the others. As for father himself, he was standing by the fireplace, his face somber and his hands behind his back. There was a strained expression on his face, something that made Jon pause, before closing the door behind him. All of a sudden he felt the tension in the air, thick and heavy. He just didn't know why it was there. Was father going to drop a hint about him joining the Night's Watch? No, that would not have been like father at all. Besides, it would have been him hinting at it to father rather than the other way around. Sit down please, Jon, father said quietly. I need to talk to you. Jon nodded and then sat, but then had to wait as father frowned at the floor, the wall behind him, the door, Lady Catelyn, the floor again and finally at him. Father, Jon said quietly, have I done something wrong? A small snort escaped father's lips, whilst Maester Aemon smiled slightly and Lady Catelyn shook her head with a sigh. No, Jon, father sighed eventually. This is not about anything that you have done. This is about who you are. Jon looked at father, confused. Who I am? I'm sorry father, what do you mean? Father looked at him somberly. Jon, I am sorry. This is something that I have put off for far too long. But I was afraid. I was burdened with a secret and an oath I swore not long after you were born. The oath your mother made me swear. His mother. Jon's head swam for a moment. Father was talking about his mother. The mother that he had always wondered about, always worried about. Always feared that she might be dead. Dread pooled at the bottom of his stomach, nauseating him for a long moment. Father sighed and then stared him in the eye. You have to understand something, Jon. It has always been my intention to keep you safe. That was why I have never spoken of your mother before. Because her identity had be a secret if you were to be kept safe. Jon, you are a Stark. No one should ever doubt that. And I am sorry for this blow, as it must be a bitter one, but as I said I had to keep you safe. I am not your father. John stared at father in shock as the ground seemed to fall to pieces beneath him and plunge him into an ocean of cold water that he never even suspected was there before. I don't, he paused to try and clear his suddenly dry throat. I don't understand, he finally croaked. Please father, I don't understand. How can I be Stark if I am not your son? Father sighed yet again and then pulled his chair over and clasped John's hand. Because you are a Stark. You are my nephew John. I would be very proud to call you my son, but you are in fact my nephew. He looked at father in confusion for a long moment, his brain racing. Your nephew. But why would you want to keep me secret and safe? Horror suddenly stole over him and he stared at Lady Caitlin. I cannot be the son of Uncle Brandon, can I? But father shook his head. No, he said sadly. You are not the son of Brandon. He took a deep breath. You are the son of my sister, Lionel. An image flashed through his face, the image of Aunt Lionel's statue in the catacombs. He'd always been fascinated by that statue, by that face. The face of the woman whose abduction by Prince Rhaegar had started the War of Robert's Rebellion. Had led to the downfall of the Targaryens. You mean that, my mother has always been in the catacombs? He croaked the question that was laden with shock, and he saw Lady Caitlin look at him with shock of her own in her eyes and then sudden tears. Father leant forwards. Yes, and I am so sorry, John. But her last request to me, her dying request to me, was that I should keep you safe. That meant pretending that you were my son. There was no other way that I could honor your mother's final request. He released his hands, then slumped back in his seat. She was dying. Birth fever. At a place called the Tower of Joy, on the border between the Stormlands and Dawn. She was guarded by 3 members of the King's Guard. There were 7 of us. 7 fought against 3. Only 2 survived. Myself and Howland Reed. I found you and your mother in one of the rooms in the tower. The fools hadn't found a midwife for your mother. She might be alive if they had. Silence filled the room for a moment before John finally thought things through. Wait, my Aunt Lionel was my mother, then who was my father? Lord Eddard Stark looked around the room and then looked back at John, who had finally made that final connection. My father is Rhaegar Targaryen. He blurted the words in utter horror. The son of the Mad King. Yes, father said somberly. He was. And he was not his father. You have to understand that. His reasons were his own and we'll never know why he did what he did, but he was not mad. But you're saying that I'm part Targaryen, John mumbled in horror. That my grandfather was the Mad King. Listen to me, Jon Snow, Maester Aemon said as he leant forward slightly and held out a pointed finger in emphasis. It is said that when a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin to decide if they be sane or not. That is a lie, but there is just enough truth attached to the edges of it to make it sound true. Yes, Aerys was mad. Driven mad by his burden, by his past, by his own throne. But not all Targaryens were mad. He sat back. And old as I am, I should know. Jon stared at the old man. Yes, he knew that he was the Maester of Castle Black and that his name was Aemon, but there was something about the way that he had spoken that had gotten the hairs on the back of his neck on edge. Who are you? A mirthless smile played about the lips of the old man for a moment. My father was Maker, the first of his name. My brother Aegon reigned after him, when I had refused the throne, and he was eventually followed by his grandson Aerys, whom they called the Mad King. Jon swallowed. You are Aemon Targaryen, he said wonderingly. You refused the Iron Throne and took the Black. I did what I thought was right, just as your uncle has done the same to keep you safe. There are many men who would have killed you for your blood, Jon Snow. Never forget that. And never forget that although you are half Stark, you are also half Targaryen, and therefore my great-great-grandnephew. And that I have memories of my father and brother being good and just rulers. The old man smiled wearily. I have listened carefully to you over these days that I have been here, Jon Snow. And I have heard many good things about you. You remind me of my brother, Aegon. A quiet boy who wanted to help people. Do not fear your blood, Jon Snow. And do not blame Lord Stark for not telling you of your true origins. The smile deepened. As I said, he saved your life. And if he had not, then I would not be sitting here and greeting one of my own blood. John sat there, his thoughts whirling about like a seed pod caught in a stream. Father. I mean uncle. I have much to think about and, he paused. I think that I must start by continuing to call you father, must I not? It would be safer, the Lord of Winterfell said with a sigh. And then he set his chin. My wife has also given me some advice about you. I will write to the king and ask him to make you a Stark. It is what Lyanna would have wanted. It will protect you again, but it will also bind you closer to Winterfell as if that was ever necessary. And this was something that shocked even more than the fact that he now knew that he was the grandson of the Mad King. To be a Stark in name instead of a Snow, and to owe it to Lady Catelyn, who he knew had never liked him. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then felt such a look of total confusion come over his face that actually sparked a laugh out of Lady Stark. You pardon, John, but you reminded me of the look on my brother's face the first time my sister hit him with a fish. She sobered. John, as a legalized bastard you would come after Rickon in the succession, or any other sons that Ned and I might have. You must realize that. I would be happy just to be a Stark, he said in a choked voice. That would be all I would ever need. Not to be that word. Tears blurred his vision and he wiped them angrily away. Your pardon. Hay fever perhaps. Mayhaps it is, father said with a cough and then a hasty smile. Now there is much I can tell you about your mother. And even some about your father. Jory. The day and a half that it took the Black Betha to get to White Harbor were bloody interminable, to use a word that he had once heard old Lewin once use. The wind was brisk, but there was only so much speed Sir Davos could get out of the ship. Jory spent the time watching the crew go about their business and worrying about his charge. Fortunately he had Sir Davos himself to keep him company. The older man was quiet and calm and had a habit of speaking nothing but sense, leavened with a bit of good humor every now and then, as if he could sense just how tense Jory felt. Lord Baelish's man Mycon seemed to be the only villain on the ship, which was not to say that the crew were made up of good men. Oh, some would slit your throat for the right price, Sir Davos had told him the previous morning. But they are loyal to me. See, they know me. Sailed with me. God's help them, they trust me. And for the most part they are good lads. They'll get us to White Harbor safe, believe me. And they had. Jory could see the white walls now in the distance as the ship cracked briskly along, with one of Sir Davos's sons at the tiller as his father kept an eye on the sails. Little Robb Returns was next to him, solemnly pointing out things like black-headed gulls and the odd strangely shaped white cap that reminded the boy of something funny. That was the other thing. The boy had, well, not started the trip well. He had clung to Anna, the one person that he really knew on the ship, and had spent a lot of time wailing for his mother and complaining about the smells. He'd also had one of his shaking fits, which Anna had dealt with matter-of-factly. And then Sir Davos had somehow worked his spell on the little boy. He'd been quiet and matter-of-fact, not gruff, just quietly informative. He'd told the little lordling what the new birds were, how the ship sailed, what at least some of the smells were, others had been glossed over, what some of the knots were called, and above all some of the safer sea shanties. And young Robb Returns had been coaxed a little out of his shell. He looked to one side. Anna was watching Sir Davos and his stern little guest with a fond smile on her face and her arms crossed under that bosom of hers. He looked away. He had more important things than that to worry about. White Harbor awaited. The moment that the ship tied up at the main wharf, Sir Davos sent word to Lord Wyman Marndale about the identity of his passengers, and within the hour an honour guard led by Sir Wendell Marndale, second son of Lord Marndale, was at the wharf, ready to escort them all to the new castle. Sir Davos joined them for the ride up, which was fast and nervous on Jory's part. He did not trust as easily as he had before, and he knew it. Which was both a good thing and a bad thing. He needed to be alert and yet not a paranoid fool. Lord Marndale was in the main hall and was still as huge as ever and as jolly, but Jory had always had a shrewd suspicion that there was something more to the man than just a fat jolly loyal man. And that suspicion was proved that day. Lord Marndale had welcomed the little lordling with just the right amount of deference mixed with joviality, quickly putting the tired little boy at his ease. Whilst one of Lord Wyman's grandchildren, the one with greenish hair for some reason, played with young Robert in the corner of the hall. Jory, Sir Davos and Anna all clustered around Lord Marndale. Lord Stark sent word of your coming, and I shall send ravens to Winterfell and King's Landing to tell of your safe arrival, he told them quietly. But I was most alarmed to hear of the man on your ship, Sir Davos. And you said that you had word on who this man worked for. Sir Davos coughed gently. Lord Petter Baelish, he told the Lord of White Harbour quietly. Lord Marndale absorbed this piece of information with a slightly raised eyebrow. Interesting, he said softly. And most worrying. He seemed to mull things over for a moment and then he nodded. My son Sir Wendell will escort you to Winterfell with 24 of my most trusted men. I doubt that Littlefinger has too many men here in the north, but I am not going to take any chances. Not with the only heir of Lord Arryn in my hall. Thank you, my lord, Jory said, feeling a little of the worry leech away. That would be right noble of you. It would indeed, Lord Marndale, Sir Davos rumbled. I must return to King's Landing and report this all to Lord Stannis. Please give him my regards, Lord Marndale replied, still visibly thinking. And tell him that I will do my duty to Lord Arryn by the escort to Winterfell. What will you do with Littlefinger's man? My sons Dale and Allard are watching over him. I trust my crew, but every port has factors and merchants and, spies, Sir Davos. Spies and any ne'er-do-wells. I admit that freely. Every port has them. And the fingers are not too far away. I would be surprised if Littlefinger does not have anyone in this city in his pocket. And we shall not take that chance. Your pardon, my lord, Anna piped up, but before we leave White Harbour we must visit an apothecary. Young Lord Robert's medicine for his falling sickness was knocked over the voyage and half of it was lost. I know of an apothecary here in White Harbour, my lord, Sir Davos stated quietly. I must sail on the next tide after we finish provisioning, so mayhaps we should do that at once. Lord Marndale said, and then waved a hand at them. Off with you then. Jory Castle, please stay and guard the young eagle. Jory had little intention of letting young Robert Arryn out of his sight any time soon, but still nodded and said all the right words. He had given Lord Arryn his word that he would see his son safely to Winterfell, and he would damn well keep that word. So he watched Sir Davos and Anna as they hurried out and then turned his attention back to the hall, where the little lordling was now listening sleepily to a gentle tale of boats on the sea, as told by Lord Marndale himself. He smiled as the boy slowly subsided onto his side and was then gently wrapped up in a blanket by the girl with the green hair, before Willits carefully took him to his room. Jory followed and then nodded at the man as he left, leaving him to guard the door. He minded not the wait. He had stood guard before and he welcomed the time to think. The escort to Winterfell would be a good thing, but it would add to the complexities of the trip. Inns would have to be taken over, shelter found. The north was a hard land, and any man who took traveling over it lightly was a fool. A dead fool. And so he stood and guarded and measured the distances and times that lay ahead of them with his mind. It was just an hour or so later that he heard hurried steps to one side, and he turned his head to see Willits again, with one of Lord Marndale's men. Lord Marndale requests your immediate presence in the hall, the latter panted. It is most urgent. Jory frowned, nodded at Willits, who assumed his place, and then followed the man to the hall, where he found Sir Davos and Anna once again next to Lord Marndale. The Lord of White Harbour waved him over the moment that he noticed him. As he approached the trio he could feel the tension surrounding them. Sir Davos looked worried, Lord Marndale was scowling, and Anna, well, she was straight of back, white of face and furious of countenance. Jory Castle, Lord Marndale barked as he approached, his chins wobbling, your counsel is needed. He frowned. On what matter? On the matter of the medicine of young Robert Arryn, Sir Davos said in a low voice. When we reached the apothecary he said that he could discern what medicine it was with but a few sniffs. When he did so he frowned, and then he sneezed, and then, well, he blew his nose and accused us of some dissemblance. That the medicine was anything but. Jory felt his eyebrows fly up. It is not medicine. Nay, Sir Davos said, still as quietly as before, it is not. It is a combination of chalk and some metallic powder, the name of which escapes me. The apothecary said that too much of it acts as a poison. And that over time it can provoke fits of fainting or shaking. Jory stared at the group in horror. His first reaction was to think that Baelish's man Mycon had been able to replace the medicine with poison. And then his second reaction was to blink hard and then stare at Anna. Over time it can provoke fits of fainting or shaking. Where did you get it from? Lady Erin. Anna said the words in a cold fury. Lady Erin gave me the medicine. She said that it had been recommended for her son. Recommended? I would like to meet the rogue who recommended that. Meet and geld the man. Jory rubbed his forehead in bewilderment. This makes little if any sense, he said with a groan. Unless someone wants Lord Erin's son to be dependent on that poison. The others looked at him and he knew that he had the right of it. So we must stop giving him the medicine. No, said Anna with a sigh. Apparently it is best that we diminish the dosage step by step. By the time that we reach Winterfell he should be free of it. I will return to King's Landing as soon as possible, Sir Davos said between gritted teeth. Lord Erin must know of this. And I will increase your escort to 50 men, Lord Marndaly said tersely. Get that boy safe to Winterfell Jory Castle. Get him safely there. Ned. His table in his solo was a mess by now. So many books and scraps of parchment, so many notes and scribbled bookmarks. So much rubbish, legends and fantasies, with facts scattered through them, or so he thought. Lewin and Eamon also thought so, however, and Ned frowned thoughtfully as he looked at the great map of the north that hung on one wall. Some of the oldest references in the records referred to places that had subtly different names. And some of them referred to places that he had no idea about. He looked at the table again and then back at the map. One of the oldest records was a fragment of a copy of a transcription of a carving, and it referred to a great siege. The others had besieged a crag somewhere in the western part of the north, and the hints were maddening. There was reference to Ye Stark leading the men, to the ferocity of the fighting, to the fact that the men had to win there, and then the fact that the battle ended in the others being utterly routed in one of the first big victories against them. Where was this place? It was just described as Ye Glittering Crag. But there was nothing in the north that had a name like that, or anything even close to it. The nearest that he could think of was the place called Stark's Rock, but that was nothing more than a slightly craggy hill about a day's ride to the west. It did not look like a place where a battle could even happen, still less a siege. And why would the others besiege a hill anyway? Lewin was still looking into it. He sighed and then he looked up as he heard footsteps at the doorway. Kat smiled at him as she came in, but it was not a smile that was truly happy. Are you all right, Kat? Oh, I am fine, she sighed as she sat down and then looked at the mound of papers and books on the desk. I have just been reflecting on things. He smiled slightly. Oh, he replied lightly, we have had much to reflect on. So I can see. Ned, this is a mess. She drew her chair up to the table. How can you ever find anything when it all looks like this? I get by. I remember what the book looks like, or the color of the parchment. A sigh of his own escaped his lips. Kat, so much has been lost. All we have are fragments. Bits and pieces. He leant over, picked up an old book and carefully opened it to one page. I mean, according to this, one of the first Starks in Winterfell was known as the Lawgiver and had something called Ye Fist of Winter. The writer must have known what that was, but I've never heard of it. Nor have I, Kat muttered as she looked at one of the open books. Then she paled slightly. Tales of these whites are terrible. And yet you will have to fight them. I will, Ned replied grimly. And win. I will have to, Kat. The others cannot be allowed south of the wall. Nor can the wildlings. But the issue of how to deal the wildlings has been vexing me. They would make an excellent addition to the garrison of the wall, but they have fought the Night's Watch for so long that they cannot be allies. And besides, what would they ask of me? To settle in the gift. Or the new gift. The lords in the north would set up a wail of horror that would strike ravens dead in the sky. Ned shook his head tiredly. We have so much to do and so little time. So very little time. If Robb had returned a year ago, then it would still not be enough time. I could have sent more help to the wall. The old bear has already written to say that even just the small number of extra men and construction materials that I have sent to him has been enough to think about reopening Oakenshield. But they need more. We need the resources of the south. We need Lannister gold and wheat from the Reach. We need the Knights of the Vale and the infantry of the Stormlands and Dawn. Men, horses, steel, food, supplies of all sorts. Ships as well. Kat looked at him and then nodded slowly. And then she smiled slightly. It sounds like you need King Robert and his warhammer. I know, Ned said and then smiled suddenly. I know exactly what he'd say about all this research though. Something like, Ned, just tell me what needs killing. And then he'd go and kill it. He thought back to the trident and Robert's uncontrollable fury on seeing Roriger. But how do we even kill one of the others? The books don't say. As I said, nothing but fragments and legends. How long has it been since they were last seen? How long has it been since one of them was killed? He shrugged, feeling a bitter sense of despair wash over him. Kat looked at him worriedly and then frowned slightly at the books and papers on the desk. Ned, is any of this from the mountain clans? Some of it. Nothing has arrived yet from the more northerly clans. She nodded, still frowning slightly. What of other houses that are descended from the first men? Ones in the south, I mean. Startled, he looked at her. I never thought about the south. Bronze Yone might have records in Runestone. That's one of the oldest fortresses of the first men. I'll have Lewin send a raven at once. But as he turned to the door he was forestalled by the sudden arrival of Maester Lewin himself. My lord, I beg pardon for my intrusion. There is a party of horsemen approaching the gates. They bear the banners of the last hearth. The banners of Lord Umber, and he leads them himself. Ned frowned. The great John. Here. Theon. Once Robb and John were gone he went back to the heart tree. It fascinated him. And it also terrified him. The very thought that the old gods were, watching him, had touched him in some way was, well. Theon shook his head in confusion. He was Ironborn. He was a Greyjoy of Pike. He worshipped the drowned god, even though doing so in Winterfell was difficult. But the old gods. Why had they touched him? Welcome, Theon Greyjoy. We knew your ancestors. Those words were now seared across his heart. He'd always known that he had first men amongst his ancestors, but he'd never really thought about which gods they had worshipped. The thought that they had worshipped the old gods was a troubling one. But that dream, he felt the marks on his face gingerly. And they really terrified him. He didn't think that he had scratched himself in his sleep. Maester Lewin had peered at the lines with a puzzled expression and then picked something out of one of them. A fragment of fingernail, he said. Theon looked at his hands. His nails were short but intact. No, something else had left that mark. Something dark. Something that he couldn't understand. He stared at the heart tree. The face on the mast in his dream had been just like this one, and he reached out with a hesitant hand to trace the face. He didn't know what to expect as his fingers touched the bark, but nothing happened. It was just a tree. There were no gods here. But he felt himself shiver for a moment, feeling cold for an instant. He looked at the face again, and for a moment, just the faintest fleeting moment, he thought that he could see a flash of red from the mouth. Theon backed away from the tree, shaking with fear. A gust of wind blew through the godswood for a moment, and as the hairs on the back of his neck stood up on end he took a step back. The wind almost sounded like a voice for a moment, a voice saying words that he couldn't quite make out. He was still trembling when he left the godswood. He had the oddest feeling that he had been warned, that something had touched him for some reason that he did not understand. And he felt something else. Troubled. He was Ironborn. He belonged to the drowned god. Didn't he? Ned. The party from last hearth consisted of 20 men and a wagon, all led by a tall man on a large horse who was giving orders to his men in a loud booming voice. Great John Umber was a man who was larger than life in almost every way. When he laid eyes on Ned he paused and then bowed formally. Lord Stark. Lord Umber, Ned replied, feeling a little puzzled. This was oddly formal for the Great John. But then the big man grinned. That enough of the formal bit. Ned nodded, and then Great John roared with laughter and enveloped him a bear hug. Ned. Good to see you again. He laughed and slapped the big man on the back as he released him. Good to see you, Great John. What brings you to Winterfell though? The Great John let out an explosive sigh and then jerked a thumb at the wagon. You asked for records on the others. I've brought everything I could from the last hearth. The normal jovial smile that was on his face was gone. Ned, I need to talk to you. It's important. Ned looked at the huge man. Yes, this was important. When the Umbers were serious, then something was deadly important. Very well, let's go to my solar. I'll get Lewin to attend to the records you've brought. Eamon as well. Maester Eamon, the Great John replied, his bushy eyebrows flying upwards. From the wall. He brought records from Castle Black. The Great John absorbed this and then frowned, before taking a saddlebag off the rear of his own horse carefully, as if it contained something precious. We definitely need to talk then, Ned. He paused. And do you have any ale? Ale was indeed available for the Great John, and once he had quaffed his first mug of it, he sat in Ned's solar and peered at the desk in some bemusement whilst cradling his second one in his hands. The saddlebags were at his side. That's a lot of research, Ned. Sorry that I'm adding to it. Don't be sorry. Now what's so urgent? The Great John sighed and then looked down at the floor of the solar for a long moment. When he looked up, his voice was very quiet by his standards. Ned, why are you asking about the others? That was a good question, and Ned sank into his own chair. Great John, there is a long story attached to that question. You think that they have returned, don't you? Startled, Ned looked at his old friend, who stared levelly back at him. I'm not a fool, Ned, Great John rumbled with a slight smile that quickly vanished. Wilderling raids are worse than I've ever known them. And the Night's Watch is weaker than it's ever been. The gift is all but abandoned, and my men fend off raids by parties of wildlings almost every month. The prisoners say that death marches on the wall. And the word from Eastwatch by the Sea is that even the Skagasi are getting raided, and if even they are getting visits from the wildlings, then they must be either mad or desperate. Something is pushing them south. Something terrible. Ned stared at the Great John for a long moment. No, he was no fool. But there was something else about the man. There was a look in his eyes that took him aback, something dark and haunted. Yes, he said eventually. They have returned. And the tale of how I know is a dark one. The Great John held up a hand. You are the Stark in Winterfell, he rumbled. Of all the men in the north, you are the one that would know if they had returned. There was something in his voice that troubled Ned. A note of ironclad certainty. He was used to being trusted, but the Great John seemed to think that the Starks would have known at once about the return of the others. He was about to open his mouth and ask about that when the huge man straightened almost formally in his chair. I need to do this properly, or my ancestors will kick my ass from here to the wall when I die. Right. Lord Stark, I, Lord Umber of the Last Hearth, do hereby inform you that the hearthstone has changed color and that my watch over it has therefore ended. He looked at Ned. Ned looked back at him, baffled. What? Great John looked troubled. Did I say it wrong, Ned? Say what wrong? About the hearthstone. Great John, I have not the faintest bloody idea what you're talking about. What's the hearthstone? Ned had seen a great many expressions on the face of Great John Umber before. Amusement. Shock. Blind rage. Puzzlement. But never had he ever seen such a look of utter shock from his old friend. What? The Lord of the Last Hearth asked the word in a very small and horrified voice. You don't know what the hearthstone is? No, Ned said through clenched teeth. I do not. Damn it, Great John, what is it? I don't understand. You're the Stark in Winterfell. Your father would have told you. On the day you came of age. A horrible feeling came over Ned. Great John, he pointed out gently, I came of age in the Vale, at the Eyrie. I was ward to Jon Arryn. When I returned to Winterfell, my father was dead. A memory tickled the back of his mind. Brandon. Brandon must have known. Lyanna wrote to me that our brother had been troubled the day after he came of age, that he had been here, in what was then father's solar, for most of the day. The Great John groaned and then threw most of the remaining ale straight down his throat. Fuck me, he said bitterly. I never thought of that. I never bloody thought of that. My father told me on the day I came of age. I thought that your father had done too. Damn Aerys fucking Targaryen. Damn him to the lowest level of the darkest hell that exists. There was a depressed pause, before the lord of the last half passed a hand over his face and then smoothed his beard. Right then. Bugger it, I never thought I'd have to tell you all this. I thought that you'd have known about it, although what I know is bloody little. Right. Ned, there are 3 oaths that every umber of the last half must swear on the day he comes of age. The first is loyalty to the Stark in Winterfell. The second is to protect the crag that the last half is built on, even at the cost of our own lives. And the third is to guard the Hearthstone. To watch over it, no matter what happens. He shuddered and then looked around for the jug of ale that Ned had gotten for him. Bloody thing gives me the creeping horrors every time I look at it, he muttered as he reached over and poured himself another mug. All I know is that just before the last hearth was built, one of your ancestors gave it to one of my ancestors and told him to protect it. To watch over it. To check on the bloody thing once a year, which is a duty that I'm bloody glad to be rid of. It's not ours, Ned, it's yours. What is this Hearthstone? Ned asked thoughtfully, his mind whirling with questions about all the things that his close-mouthed father had never been able to tell him about. The Great John peered owlishly at him and then reached down into the saddlebags, from which he pulled out a small bag, which in turn contained a small box made of stone. It had a lid and it also had runes on the outside, and the Great John was holding it as gingerly as if it was made of glass. Or as if it was a viper from dawn. Every year I've opened this box and looked inside, the Great John rumbled. It's always been black as coal. Blacker than, he paused, visibly hunting for words. Blacker than night. It was like there was a hole in the box. And then your raven arrived asking for information about the others, and the news of the latest wilderling raid came in, and I thought about the Hearthstone. I don't know what it is, Ned, that's been lost. I don't know what it does, I don't even know what it's made from. All I know, all that was passed on from my forefathers, was that if it ever changed color then we had to bring it to the Stark in Winterfell. As I have now done. Ned nodded slowly. That's all you know. That's all I bloody know, Ned. My forefathers might have known more, but over the years that might have been stripped away by time and death. He held put the box. Please take it, Ned. Every member of my family has always hated the fucking thing. We've always kept it at the lowest level of the last hearth, in the old tunnels. It belongs to the Starks, not to us. I have no idea why your ancestors told mine to look over it. Perhaps because we were loyal. Last loyal hearth before the wall, that's what your ancestors named our hold. And that's the name we took for it. Ned sighed and then reluctantly took it. The box was cold to the touch, and there's something about it that made the hairs on the back of his arm stand up. He opened the box carefully and then peered into it. Inside he could see a small round stone, the size of the last joint of his thumb. It looked worn and old, very old. There might have been a rune carved onto the top of it. And it was a murky green color, not black at all. What am I supposed to do with this? The Great John shifted uneasily. When I saw that it had changed color I touched it. We've supposed to do that every year as well. Last time it gave me a hell of a bloody headache. My father told me that all he ever saw after touching it was black spots. But after it changed color, Ned, I saw the wall. And something else. He swallowed. The dead, Ned. Marching on the wall. Almost pissed me breeches, seeing something like that. Ned looked at him sharply. You had a vision of the wall? The other man mumbled, taking another gulp of ale. Then he looked at Ned curiously. You don't seem that surprised by that, Ned. I've had one myself. From the old gods. The Great John stared at him, this time in awe. The old gods. Really, Ned? And I know what you mean about wanting to piss your breeches. He peered back into the box and then took a deep breath and picked it up. It felt surprisingly warm in his hand and he weighed it in the palm of his hand. Nothing felt different at all. Anything? The Great John asked with a hint of nervousness, almost hiding behind his mug of ale. Nothing, Ned replied. And then he blinked. Something felt different somehow. He shook his head slightly. Doom. Ned looked around the room. What was that? What was what? Doom. That. That noise. Like someone in the crypts is beating on a drum. Ned, I feel and hear nothing like that. Doom doom. His palm quivered and Ned looked down at the hearthstone in astonishment. It seemed to be, well, beating, like a heart. And the color was lighter. You don't see that. See what, Ned? Your eyes, Ned. The great John was staring at him, looking at him with awe. They are green. And your pupils are red. Doom doom doom. Ned's throat was suddenly drier than the deserts of dawn. The hearthstone was beating more and more, he could feel the blood thundering in his veins, a mist seemed to be descending over his vision. He opened his mouth again but then he suddenly froze. The shade of his father seemed to be standing to one side of the great John all of a sudden, staring at him intently. He was mouthing something, but he couldn't make it out. And then Brandon appeared next to him and then his grandfather, and then ghostly shade after ghostly shade, crowding the room with what must be stark after stark. Doom 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 doom. And then the wall at the back of the solar seemed to crumble and he seemed to swoop through it, like a raven on the fleetest of wings. North he flew, his mind stunned as he looked down at the lands of the north as they passed far beneath him. How was this possible? What was this? A vision. And what a vision! The wall appeared before him and he winced at the sight. He could see the abandoned castles, he could see the neglect in the gift, he could see the small numbers of Night's Watch, he could almost smell the despair. And then the wall was behind him and the land beyond it was stretching out in front of him. He could see the wildlings beneath him, see the giants as they rumbled and stamped over the countryside, see the mammoths. He could feel despair there as well, and hate and desperation. Doom 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 doom. Something seemed to crystallize in the air around him and suddenly he felt cold. Not the cold of the hands or the face, but the cold of the heart that indicated more than despair, absolute hate. Absolute darkness. He seemed to be heading downwards, towards a low mountain ahead of him. He could see lines in the snow ahead of it, what looked like walls that had long ago crumbled into ruin. Age hung over it, age and death. There were things patrolling around it, things that he could not see clearly and he was somehow glad of that. Closer and closer to the mountain and then suddenly he was flying straight at the ground. He wanted to fling his arms up to stop but instead he slid through the snow and ice, the earth and stone. Down he went, bewildered, and then out into a great hall, where he finally slowed. That hall was dark, lit only by shards of light coming from somewhere far above him. It was covered in ice and snow, a barren hall with only a dais towards one end, where a figure sat in a throne made from ice and bone. There were things in the dark areas of the hall, things that might once have been human, but which were now not, and as he looked at them they seemed to feel his gaze and mew and wail and throw twisted arms out in an effort to hide their faces, as if they were ashamed at what they had become. Ned drifted closer to the throne. Behind it there was a great dead tree, a mockery of a heart tree, with black bark and bare rotted branches, with a face carved into it that seemed to glow with a terrible blue light. And the figure on the throne, well, it was human-shaped. Had been human once. Now its skin was blue and white and was dressed in old armor that seemed to almost shine dully. Its eyes were closed and a crown of horns seemed to be on its bald head, and then Ned realized with a jolt of horror that the horns were growing out of its skin. He gazed at it, horrified. The face almost had stark features. The cheekbones especially. And then the figure opened its eyes. Azure orbs they were. Bluer than the sky at midsummer. And colder than the heart of a glacier. The eyes went to him at once and he stared back, too afraid to move even if he had been able to. Bone and sinew creaked and then the figure on the throne stood and gazed at him. And then it smiled for a long moment and said something in a tongue that man had long forgotten. All he could sense was hate and cold and evil. The figure stopped talking and then smiled again, and then its hand shot out and its fingers clenched. The air around Ned seemed to creak, but he sensed that the odd crystallizing sensation he had felt earlier was protecting him, because the creaking stopped after a moment. The figure on the throne, the king of the others, if a king he was, frowned at his hand and then clenched it again. Once again the air creaked and groaned, but once again it seemed to meet resistance. The other stared at him with bafflement and then rage. It threw back its head and screamed, revealing white and fanged teeth, screamed a scream of rage and fury. The ice in the hall shook with the sound, shards cracking and falling, and some of the things in the shadows wailed and put their hands over their ears. The mockery of the heart tree bent like it was caught in a storm, branches snapping off. The ground shook and the throne trembled, and still Ned was unscathed. And then the king of the others ceased his scream and just looked at him, his finger coming up to point at him. The azure eyes narrowed and he peered at him as if he was committing his face to memory. And then the figure started to chant something, in a tongue that was even more alien, dark and twisted and filled with power. Ned could feel it building, and then suddenly he was falling backwards, pulled by a wind that seemed to surround him, tumbling like a leaf caught in the wind. On and on he flew, seeing snatches of things out of the corner of his eyes. The wall. Castle Black. The last hearth. Winterfell. He was home. He wanted to be home. He blinked, and as his eyes opened again he was back in his solar, with the Great John still in front of him. Ned felt as weary as he ever had before, and he was panting as if he had run a mile unshod. Every part of him seemed to hurt, even his hair for some reason. "Ned," the Great John was shouting at him, "are you all right? Speak to me, Ned." With a shaking hand he placed the hearthstone back in the box. "They are coming for us," he muttered through a mouth as dry as ashes. "The king of the others is awake. They are coming." And then he fell backwards in his chair and fainted dead away. Chapter 5. Chapter text. Robb. There was so much to learn, Robb thought almost despairingly as he looked at the list of noble houses of the north. Yes, he already knew the names. But it was the complex web of details that was driving him raving mad, the links between major houses and minor houses, not to mention the histories of those houses. He knew about the revolts of the Boltons in far more detail now, but he had not known about the tensions that existed in some of the lands around them. The knowledge had depressed him more than a bit. He knew now that he should never have trusted Roose Bolton, that the Roose Bolton's main allegiance was to Roose Bolton first, and then, perhaps, to father, based on what they had been through in the War of Robert's Rebellion. He, Robb, had not the same amount of loyalty owed to him. He thought about all the dead men that he had led south of Moat Cailin, in that future that must never happen, the dead that had died for nothing. He had been the king in the north, but he had not even been able to hold his own lands. Well, that would change. He had the north to protect now, and he would do so to the last drop of blood in his veins. He closed the book and massaged the bridge of his nose. He had a slight headache from his studies, and he sighed and stood up from the bench in the courtyard where he had been studying. A cawing noise from one of the walls to one side caught his eye, and he looked up in time to spot a flash of black. Just a crow. And then he saw the tower and he sculled. There it was. There was the tower where Bran had fallen. What had he seen there? He could guess. Oh, how knightly of that bastard Lannister, how brave, a man against a boy. He remembered the false sympathy on that bastard's face and the honeyed words of the Queen, with their underlying drip of poison. And then after that the scars on the palms of his mother. No. It would not happen again. He would swear any oath on that. He turned from the tower and strode across the courtyard, detailing all the things that he and father would have to do. He wanted to look into the supplies for the wall that afternoon. That, and work out a way of sending more men. 100 men sent now would be worth twice that number in a year, and the more after that the better. He knew how hard it would be though. Winter was coming, men needed to fed, watered, paid, housed, mounted. The sound of laughter broke him out of his grim reverie, laughter and then song. Oddly enough his heart lightened. Roose Bolton could not be trusted, but Domeric Bolton was another matter. He was either the greatest dissembler ever, or he was a genuinely kind and courtly young man, skilled with a harp, skilled with a song, and always ready with a smile. He had already given young Bran a number of lessons on riding, and he could tell that his younger brother already admired the heir to the Dread Fort. As did Sansa, who he could see with Domeric as he sang to her. Septa Mordane was sitting to one side, attending to her embroidery with a slight smile, and when she saw Robb she nodded respectfully to him and then quietly stole away. Sansa and Domeric both saw him at the same time, the first with a smile and a frown, and the second with a courteous nod as he continued his song. Robb smiled at them both and then politely listened. Yes, the man was skilled in music. He could certainly hold a note far better than he ever could. When Domeric finished he bowed to Sansa as she applauded and then turned to Robb. Your pardon, Robb, but is your lord father around? He had turned slightly pink as he stole a look at Sansa, who was blushing suddenly and trying to look demure. I would like to speak to him. Oh. He had an inkling that this might happen and he schooled his features to look grave and thoughtful. I believe that he is in his solar, he replied. Allow me to take you there. My thanks. Domeric turned to Sansa and bowed again. My lady. Thank you, Domeric, she answered, and then plucked a rose from the nearest bush, disguising the sudden wince from a thorn quite well. Will you wear this for me? I shall, he replied with a smile, taking it from her and threading it through a buttonhole. Lead on, please, Robb. They strode away across the courtyard, Robb leading with a slight smile. Oh, Sansa was taken with this one. And from what he had heard and seen, Domeric Bolton was not his father, was far better than his father, and above all he was many, many leagues better than that little shit Joffrey. As they walked they talked about this and that, the hunting in the area, the signs that winter was not yet here, and how much Domeric had enjoyed his stay at Winterfell. I hear that a party from the last hearth arrived this morning, Domeric told him, and Robb frowned. He had missed that. I did not know that, he replied as they passed through a doorway and then up the stairs that spiraled their way up. Did you see them? I certainly heard them, Domeric quipped. The man leading them was most loud. I believe that it was Ned. The voice boomed down the corridor. Are you all right? Speak to me, Ned. It was coming from the solar, and it was the voice of Great John Bloody Umber, and Robb's heart leapt. The man had been his fiercest bannerman and loudest voice, and he seemed to be worried about father. He tore down the corridor, Domeric at his heels, and burst into the solar. Father was in his chair, shaking as if in the grip of a terrible palsy, panting as if he had run a race. He was holding something in his hand, which he now placed into a box, and the Great John was staring at him as if he was terrified. And then he saw father's eyes. Green fire seemed to be in them, with red at the center, and when he heard Domeric gasp in astonishment he knew that the heir to the Dread Fort had seen what he had seen as well. They are coming for us, father said in a voice like iron being beaten. The king of the others is awake. They are coming. And then his eyes closed and he collapsed in his chair. After a moment of horror Robb leapt for him. Father, he cried, and he saw the Great John look at him. Great John. What happened? The Great John stared at him, deeply confused. Who are you again? Robb Stark. What happened? God's boy, you look like a Tully. Oh yes, I gave your lord father the Hearthstone. It was given to my ancestors from yours thousands of years ago, to be watched over, to be protected. It changed color this year, so I brought it south to your father. And he held it and he saw something. I know not what. But you heard him. The Great John looked grimmer than he had ever seen him look. The others have returned. Oh gods, Domeric choked as he crouched by father and stared at him. The others. Robb shook his head. What is this Hearthstone? Something that we have kept watch over for many years, the Great John rumbled. We were closest to the wall. I think that was why we were given it. I know not why else. He peered at father. Perhaps we should give him some ale. And then father came awake suddenly. His eyes were normal again, but there was a look on his face of deep intent. He looked about wildly for a moment and then he looked at Robb. Robb. Father. Search my solar. Search Winterfell. Look for anything my father might have left. Anything at all. Look for old rooms, old records. Search. And then he collapsed again. Robb stared at his father and then ran to the door and peered out. He could see Lewin hurrying down the corridor. Come, Lewin. Quick. And then he looked back at Domeric and the Great John. We must search. Tyrion. Father was sitting in the smaller of the breakfast rooms that morning. Casterly Rock was a huge fortification with a huge number of rooms, but there was nothing like having breakfast with the sun on your face. Well, it was mid-morning at least. Ish. Tyrion swung himself up onto the chair at the table and cast a careful eye over father. He was sitting at the head of the table and was glowering at a piece of paper in front of him. It was not a nice glare. It was a glare that dared the small document not to burst into flames. He looked further down the table, where Uncle Kevin was busy tearing a small roll apart with his fingers and doing his best not to look worriedly at his brother. He then caught Tyrion's eye and shook his head ever so slightly. No, asking father what was wrong was not a good idea. Instead Tyrion bowed to everyone from his seat, chose some bread and honey and then ate quietly as he ran through what he'd ate the previous night and if there had been any exotic cheese involved. He was pretty sure that there had not been, but that wine had dulled his recollections of the meal just a bit. As he dabbed his mouth with his napkin and then thought about perhaps a honeycake or two, father finally stood up with a growl, grabbed the piece of paper and stalked over to the window. "Are you well, Tywin?" Uncle Kevin asked quietly. "No," grunted father, before stalking back to the table and dropping the piece of paper in front of his brother. "I do not like things that I cannot explain. And the more I think about this, the less it makes sense." His uncle picked up the crumpled piece of paper, smoothed it out, read it and then frowned at father, before shoving it down the table at Tyrion. "Odd," he said cautiously. Tyrion reached out and picked it up and read it. Then he read it again and then a third time. Only then did he speak. "Eddard Stark is asking the Lord of the North for information, legends, stories and other information about the others." "It would seem so," grumped father as he stalked back to the window and glared out of it. "What do you make of it?" Tyrion's first thought was that perhaps Eddard Stark had contracted a sudden case of curiosity about the legends of the North, but then he had second, third and fourth thoughts about saying that. Father would not be behaving like this for an answer that simple, nor would he react well to such an answer. Instead he leant back in his chair and thought deeply and swiftly. Yes, father was right. This was odd. A Lord Paramount of Westeros, especially a lord like Eddard Stark, who was said to be deeply serious, would not send out ravens to his main lords on a whim about a legend. This meant something. After more thought he had to confess that if it did mean something then he knew not what. Which irritated him. "This makes no sense," he said eventually. This provoked a snarl from his father. "I know that. Stark merely wants information on the legendary others," Uncle Kevin muttered. "It's odd, but am I missing something?" "Uncle, from what I've heard of Ned Stark I do not think that he would send a raven lightly. But this seems so trivial that I do not understand it. I made the mistake of underestimating the North once," father muttered as he clasped his hands behind his back and glared harder at a hill in the distance. "After Ned Stark led the first northern host to travel south of the Neck for hundreds of years and won at the Battle of the Bells and then at the Trident, I swore that would never underestimate that man ever again. He holds his honor too high and the man would not last a month at King's Landing, but he is not to be underestimated. And this message, means something. I just do not know what." He turned on his heel and glared at them both. "I have seen the Games of Thrones played by many men. I have seen it played by madmen and lost, like Aerys Targaryen. I have seen it won by savagery and brilliance, aided by luck, like Robert Baratheon. I have seen it bungled repeatedly by oafs like Mace Tyrell. And I have seen it apparently thrown away by dreamy fools like Rhaegar Targaryen. But this move by Eddard Stark, it does not fit into any stratagem that I can think of. It makes no sense." He bit the last 4 words out as if they pained him and then he turned and glowered again through the window. Tyrion ran a number of possible answers to that through his head, decided that none of them were much good when father was in this kind of mood and instead devoted himself to further thought, broken by a yawn. Yes, he really did have to ask what the cheese had been last night. Then he paused. Could this be a coded message to his banners? But what? And why? There is no reason for the North to plot at the moment, surely. Robert is a friend to the Starks, they grew up together. Father's glance at him might possibly have held a smidgen of slight approval. Then you see the problem. It could be something to do with the wildlings, Uncle Kevin mused. I have heard that their raids get worse every year. Yes, but the others? Tyrion shook his head. Might as well ask about Grumpkins and Snooks. Why the others? I do not know, father said crossly. And to make matters even more confusing, word has reached me that the Maester of Castle Black is at Winterfell on this matter. Do you know his name, Tyrion? He thought quickly and then paused. Wait, isn't the Maester of Castle Black Aemon Targaryen? The one who turned down the Iron Throne? He still lives. Uncle Kevin spluttered, having been surprised in the middle of drinking some weak ale. Oh, he still lives. Father ground out. Eris was always looking over one shoulder at the wall when he was at his most paranoid. Tyrion absorbed this and then pursed his lips slightly in thought. We need answers then, Father. Perhaps I should take a trip to Winterfell. Father swiveled an eye at him. With what possible pretext? Why, I have always wished to visit the north. And to see the wall. And should I happen to ask in Winterfell about the others, who know what I might discover? There was a pause. Uncle Kevin looked at Tyrion worriedly, whilst Father looked out of the window musingly. It might be dangerous, Father said eventually. But perhaps a dwarf like you might be able to find out a few things, instead of degrading this house with your drinking and whoring here. Don't think that I didn't see you yawning. Yes. I think so. Travel north, Tyrion. Go to Winterfell. Ask some questions. Don't come back until you have answers. And then Father swept out. As Father's footsteps receded down the corridor, Uncle Kevin turned to him. Are you sure about this, Tyrion? It seems a risk. 'Tis the least I can do. Why, Uncle, I shall be asking questions about legends whilst I read. And the thought of sending me into a place like Winterfell almost brought a smile to Father's face. Now how often does that happen? Uncle Kevin winced. Tyrion, this is a chance for me to see the north. The wall. Why, I can take a piss off it and be the tallest Lannister ever. And this finally brought a smile to the face of Uncle Kevin. Then I will help you plan this carefully, Tyrion. And I hope to see you back here soon. Although, must you give your father so many arrows to send at you by whoring so much? He stared at his uncle. I don't know why Father said that. I didn't visit any of the usual places at all last night. No, the yawns have another cause. What was last night's cheese again? Domeric. He vowed that he would remember the voice that Lord Stark had spoken with until the day that he died, whenever that might be. Surely the old gods had been speaking, though the Lord of Winterfell. He had heard it and trembled like a leaf at the words. The others had returned. And the king of the others was awake. And now, a day later, he and Robb and the others were still searching the main keep of Winterfell, looking for anything that might have information about the deadly enemy north of the wall. After giving the orders to search, Lord Stark had collapsed again and had been ministered to at once, first by his frantic eldest son and then by good Maester Lewin and then finally by a frantic Lady Stark. Exhaustion had been the Maester's conclusion, and Domeric and Robb had helped Lord Umber to carry Lord Stark to his bedchambers to sleep. Lord Umber had looked at him mostly strangely when he heard his name from Domeric, and he had inwardly cursed his father's reputation, as well as that of the family name. He would swear it again and again. The time would come when people would hear the name Bolton and not quiver with fear and dread. And now he, Robb, Jon Snow and the Greyjoy boy, who seemed to be always thinking about something these days, were all assembling in Lord Stark's solar, where Lord Umber was pacing about like a bear with a thorn in his foot. When they were all assembled, Lord Umber raised an eyebrow at them. Well, I found an old storeroom at the bottom of the broken tower with 6 barrels containing 1,000 old nails, Jon said quietly. But nothing else. There is nought in the first keep that we could find, sighed Robb as he gestured at Theon. Save dust and dead spiders. And I searched the crypts, Domeric said somberly. I found nothing. Jon Snow jerked his head slightly at the mention of the crypts and then he scowled slightly. We need to think about what we're looking for, he said musingly. Lord Umber, who had been rubbing his hand over his beard and scowling, looked up at this. What do you mean? Ned, I mean Lord Stark told us to search for anything that his Lord Father might have left behind for his sons about the others, anything that would have been left behind by his ancestors. Yes, Jon replied, but from what I have heard of him, Grandfather would not have left any records or objects that were precious anywhere where they could have been damaged. The broken tower leaks when it rains. So does the first keep. And the crypts are below ground. Yes, the last 2 are old, but surely past lords of Winterfell, not to mention the old kings in the north, would have found a safer, drier place for them. There was a silence whilst his words were weighed by the others. By the gods, you speak sense, boy, Lord Umber rumbled. Then we must search in the great keep itself. Is there any word of Father? Robb asked worriedly. He has slept for a day so far. Lord Umber smiled through his beard. Your Lord Father awoke an hour ago, apparently hungrier than a direwolf puppy and about as strong. He will join us soon. I'll join you now, said a voice at the doorway, and they all turned to see Lord Stark walk in. He looked tired and drawn, but there was a slight smile on his face. Great John, thank you for taking charge of Winterfell whilst I slept. He sank into his chair with a sigh and then looked at the little stone box on the table with an enigmatic look. How goes your search? Badly, Lord Umber said. Ned, your Lord Father must have had something passed down to him, some mention or hint or word. You said that Brandon was troubled for a day after he came of age. What could he have been told? I know not, Lord Stark sighed, before frowning and then looking about. Wait. Could it be that simple? What could? Robb asked. This was my father's solar before it was mine, Lord Stark said somberly. I replaced the rug and added that bookcase in the corner, but I have not touched the rest. Have you searched here? The others all looked at each other and then rather sheepish smiles emerged. It would seem not, Domeric said with a smile. Lord Stark, with your permission. Granted, Domeric, granted, Lord Stark replied as he stood with a groan. You'll have to search without my help though, as I feel as if every part of me is still tired. And so they started to search. Walls were tapped on, bookcases moved, rugs rolled up and stacked in a corner, until finally they faced the tapestries that were hung on two of the walls. One, showing a godswood with children of the forest peering out shyly from behind the trunks and branches, revealed nothing more than a wall. The second was different. It showed Bran the Builder at the wall. And behind it there was a door. A locked door. Lord Stark stared at it, deeply shocked. Why is it that I never knew that that was ever there? Why would you have, Ned? Why would you have looked for it? Lord Umber said somberly. Your father never had the chance to even tell you about it. This was all supposed to have been Brandon's. A silence fell, a somber one. Then Lord Stark stepped up to the door. Well, I am here now. He looked at the lock. One thing that father did leave was a set of keys, most of which looked as old as Winterfell. Robb, can you open the second drawer down on the left of the cupboard by the door? They should be there. He frowned slightly. I hope that one of them opens it. If father took the key to this door south with him, then, well, the wildfire would have melted it. A deeper, even more somber silence, until Robb returned with the keys. And some of them did indeed look as old as Winterfell itself. But a few looked as if they had been used more recently than the others, and Lord Stark fingered them thoughtfully and then tried them at the door. The first would not turn, nor would the second. But the third did, with a squeal of a protesting lock, and as the door opened Robb Stark muttered about the need for a little oil in the lock. There was a dark void behind the door, a passageway that Domeric knew that only the Stark in Winterfell should enter, but Lord Stark turned to them all. We will need torches, no, lanterns, he said huskily. We will need light. Lanterns were brought, and then Lord Stark stepped through the doorway, followed by Robb and Jon, then Lord Umber and then Theon and finally Domeric. There was much dust underfoot, but the air smelled dry and not damp. And after a few paces Lord Stark stopped to examine the wall. The stones are different here, he said musingly. As if this part of the keep was built around another, older, building. A tower perhaps. Domeric thought about this. Lord Stark, he called out, there are parts of the dread fort that are similarly built. Old parts built over and around. I wouldn't want to guess what might be hidden there. Given your family, lad, I really wouldn't want to know what might be in those walls of yours, Lord Umber rumbled, and Domeric was glad of the near dark, for he felt his cheeks grow hot with shame. Great Jon, go easy on the lad, Lord Stark chided, and then they passed on down the passageway until they stood in front of another door. This one was wood again, weirwood perhaps, with a direwolf carved into it. Not the usual direwolf of the Stark banner, but something older and rougher. A total silence fell, and then they all watched as Lord Stark reached out and traced the outline of the direwolf with a finger that shook slightly. And then he pushed the door, which gave with a creak of hinges. The light from the lanterns caught the dust as it billowed slowly up. There was a great stone slab in the little room, and alcoves in the walls around it. And they were all filled with odd things. There was a dull mirror of beaten bronze. A small leather bag that looked dried and rotted and by the edges that were peeping out contained what looked like arrowheads made from some kind of glittering rock. There was a skeletal hand in a small iron cage, with a dusty plaque under it, and he watched as Lord Stark brushed the dust away to reveal what looked like runes of some kind. A tiny figure of a fat man with his legs crossed, made from some kind of green stone. And then there were the cylinders the length of his arm, with caps in the end about the width of a man's fist, that were stacked in many places, as well as what remained of a great and very old book. It looked as if part had been burned at one point, and it lay on the stone slab, before a chest of very old and weathered wood. By the gods, this is old, Domeric thought with reverence. No, these are old. He looked around, seeing more things in various alcoves, and as the hairs on the back of his neck rose up a feeling came over him that all of a sudden they were no longer alone, that the ghosts of past Starks had suddenly gathered to witness this discovery. Lord Stark leaned over the bench and looked at the half-burnt book. Even some records are better than no records at all, he muttered. Robb had reached for one of the cylinders and opened it, and suddenly he looked up. Father, this is full of paper. No parchment. This one has hide, I think, Jon added, having opened one of his own. And that is no skull of anything that I have ever seen before, Theon Greyjoy said with a slight quaver as he pointed at a something that had horns growing from it. There is dust everywhere. When was that door last opened? When my father was alive, Lord Stark said with a sad smile. He held up a piece of paper that was also covered in dust. This is a note from him. To remind him to tell Brandon about, he squinted at the paper. The keys to this place. And to dust a little more often. Ned, look at this, Lord Umber said with excitement in his voice. Domeric looked over with the others at the alcove that Lord Umber was peering into. There was a little bowl there with a rune carved in the middle of it and a small depression at the bottom. That's the same rune as on the hearthstone. As if it belongs in there. Lord Stark nodded. Jon, will you go back to my solar and get that little stone box, please? And do not, for the love of the old gods, touch what's inside it. Jon Snow nodded and walked quickly out of the room. As he did, Lord Stark turned to the chest and peered at the clasp. Unlocked, he said musingly, and then opened it. The hinges on it also let out a squeal that made them all wince, before the Lord of Winterfell let out a grunt of surprise. As they all watched, he reached in and with a slight groan of effort picked up a huge mace, if such a word could describe the thing that he held. It was made of a dull metal of some sort that had not a touch of corrosion or rust. Old leather wrappings were wound around its handle, and its head, well, it was a thing designed to crush and kill. And it had stones of some sort almost like the arrowheads in the bag embedded in its head. This was not a weapon of chivalry. This was a weapon of death. Robert would love this, Lord Stark said with a slight smile. This is a mace with but one purpose. Footsteps rang on stone, and then Jon Snow was back with the little box, which he handed over to his father. Lord Stark took it with a word of thanks and then opened it, before taking a deep breath and pulling out a small worn stone. He weighed it in his hand for a long moment and then relaxed a little, before placing it into the little bowl. A perfect fit, he said. I wonder what it does. And then the bowl flared with light, as if the sun had briefly been within it, and Domeric heard a great voice in his head that drove him to his knees. The others come. The Stark calls for aid. You are needed. Jon are in. He watched the sail on the horizon start to diminish and sighed, heavily. The day had been one of the most chaotic ones at King's Landing that he could ever remember. He'd woken to discover that Robert had, for some reason that he still did not understand, decided that he had to visit Storm's End at once. He'd found the king standing in the main courtyard of the Red Keep, almost juddering with impatience as he bellowed orders at scurrying servants. Ah! John Robert had barked at him. I need to talk to you. Need to visit Storm's End. Why, your grace? Is there trouble in the Stormlands? And this had resulted in Robert staring around the courtyard for a long moment, visibly considering his words. Don't think I can explain it, Jon the King finally admitted, almost shamefaced. Feel like I'm needed there. There and elsewhere. I'll be back as soon as I can. It's just. I need to be in Storm's End. Robert had then stared north grimly for another long moment. Keep everything in place here, Jon. I'm sorry to leave so suddenly, but, he ran his hand over his beard thoughtfully. "I need to get this cut," he muttered before catching John's eye again. "I can't explain it, John. I need to be there and not here, and I know that this all makes no sense, but..." Robert held up his hands and clenched and unclenched them repeatedly. "I can't put it into words. There's something in the wind, John, something in the wind. There's fighting up ahead. There's a war coming. I don't know who we'll be fighting or where or when, but I can feel it. It's in my blood, John. And I feel more alive now that I have since the Greyjoy revolt. Renly, get your ass over here. We leave on the next tide." And so he had, with just a small retinue, including Renly and Sir Barristan Selmy. The former had had a word with John during one of the few moments of relative quiet. "I don't suppose you know why my royal brother has decided to on this visit at such short notice, do you, John?" "None whatsoever, Lord Baratheon. The king seems to have decided on this trip today." Renly had scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Odd. Even odder, I found him sparring with the master at arms this morning, with his warhammer. It left him exhausted but happy." They had both looked over at a corner of the courtyard, where Robert was getting his beard severely trimmed. All of this had left John with a feeling of great and very deep foreboding. Robert had perhaps picked up something about the great matter. But if he had, then why not stay and fight it out? And why go to the Stormlands? Why not confront the Queen? No, he must not have any idea about it all, otherwise Cersei would be in a cell, or be dead, and Robert would have confronted that traitorous bastard the Kingslayer already. So why Storm's End? He'd thought about telling the king everything, but they needed more time to move their forces into King's Landing without any of the other players around them knowing. Varys had to know. Whose side was he on, really? And what of Baelish? The more he learnt of him, the more he distrusted him. His web of financial affairs was wide and seemed to be a little too opaque in places. But there had been one good element to Robert's departure. His talk with Renly had borne some fruit. Bring back a stronger entourage of guards from Storm's End, he'd advised the youngest Baratheon. Men and lords you can trust. Renly had stared at him intently, before nodding slowly and saying that he understood. And now John stood at the docks and watched as the ship vanished off to the west. He was still amazed that Robert had taken a ship instead of riding out, but ships did not tire, nor they have to sleep at night. He wanted to get every mile out of every hour, and that worried him as well. Footsteps sounded to one side and he looked over to see Stannis approach. "Lord Baratheon." "My Lord Hand." Stannis looked out at the western horizon. "The king's trip puzzles me. And me." But he felt that he had his reasons. "We must await his return and plan how we must tell him about this great matter." Stannis winced and then lowered his voice. "He will not take it well. We must be prepared for that. And we must strike hard when we announce it. The Lannisters in this city will not take this lightly. We must be careful." John nodded tiredly. "Gods, but I hate this city," he muttered. "A city full of liars and conspiracies." The Master of Ships smiled thinly. "I have always hated this place, my Lord Hand. 'Tis a place where men lie as easily as they breathe. But there are a few who can be depended on." He handed over a small roll of paper. "Your son is safe at White Harbor. Sir Davos Seaworth sends word from there by Raven of their safe arrival. Lord Marndale has ordered that your son and his party be escorted to Winterfell by some 50 men." John took the paper with a frown. "That's a strong escort. Why so many?" "Seaworth does not say. The handwriting is not his, he does not have his letters well, but I recognize Lord Marndale's hand. But he does say that he returns at once to King's Landing with the utmost dispatch, which means that he will risk everything to get back here quickly. I know Sir Davos Seaworth. He would not be returning with such dispatch, risking his ship, unless something was the matter. Add that to the strong escort for your son and I fear that he has news of some plot or other." Ice water seemed to flow through his veins for a moment, and then he shrugged it off. "We will see what Sir Davos has in the way of news," he said eventually. "Let me know the moment he arrives." He set his jaw. "We have much to prepare for. When Robert returns we must confront him with this great matter. Can you have his bastard son moved from the smithy to perhaps the docks? We will need to keep the lad safe to use him as proof of the Queen's infidelity. It can be arranged, Stannis said curtly. Leave it to me. He nodded abruptly to Jon and then strode off. As he returned his gaze to the western horizon, Jon sighed. He wished that his son was there so that he could hug the little boy. He suddenly had the strongest feeling that he might never see him again. Jory. The further they went from White Harbor, the easier his heart rested within him. It was easier to see danger on the road. Easier to see everything. And there was also the fact that with every day that passed, the closer they got to Winterfell and home. There were two other things. With every day that passed, the little lordling seemed to change right before his eyes. At the start of the voyage he had been a dull-eyed pale little wraith, afraid almost of everything and with a spiteful and slightly demented tone to his voice. Oh, and a little stupid. And now, well, he was tanned from the sun, he looked healthier, sounded cleverer, and he was so curious about everything that there were times when Jory wished that he could shut up for 5 minutes. The medicine was being reduced day by day, and Anna had told him that it was almost all gone now, that the little boy would soon be free of whatever it was. Which left the question of who had poisoned the boy and why. Anna, he knew, had her suspicions. Everyone who ever asks about the medicine is dismissed by Lady Arryn, she had told him. Everyone. I wonder why. The medicine makes him dependent on her. But I do not serve her. I serve Lord Arryn. He stole a look at the woman from the Vale. The two of them had been dancing around each other for some time now, and he wasn't sure where this dance would end. He was hopeful of getting a better look at that chest of hair for a start. And there was the other matter. The pull to the north. He felt it more strongly the closer they got to Winterfell, and he had no idea why. Marndalis men felt it too. They were traveling in the right direction and they all knew it. He didn't want to think about what the feeling might have been like if they were moving in the other direction. What intrigued him was the fact that Anna felt it too. She had told him that her family claimed descent from the First Men, apparently through one of the old hill clans. There was more of a story there. He was going to enjoy getting it out of her. Oh, and young Robert Arryn felt it too, not as strong, but enough for the little lordling to talk about it. It must have been the Tully blood. Jory squinted at the hills off to one side and then nodded to himself. 3 more days until they'd see the towers of Winterfell on the far horizon. Just 3 more days until he could put down this burden of his. He looked over at the lordling, who was babbling a series of questions about the birds at one of Marndalis' men, who was answering him with a tolerant smile. Yes, the boy was different. And according to Anna, he reminded her of Lord Arryn's dead nephew Elbert, whom she had seen when she was herself just a girl. He sobered slightly, recalling that Lord Arryn had had a number of heirs, all of whom had died. Well, not this one. By the gods, not this one. Ned. Lewin knocked briskly at the door and then bustled in with yet another fistful of messages from the ravens in his tower. From Bear Island and the last hearth, my lord, he muttered deferentially as he handed them over. And from the cawing I heard as I was bringing these to you, more ravens are arriving. Thank you, Lewin, Ned said as he received them and then watched the man leave quickly. A small smile played around his lips as soon as the maester was gone. When he had seen the new records, and the objects, Lewin had been like a small child being given a honeyed spoon to lick clean. As had Maester Aemon, who had put off his return to Castle Black to help Lewin with the work of looking at everything. The old blind Maester had a deep knowledge of runes that had been a blessing. He opened the first. Mage Mormont had written it herself, "The long night comes. House Mormont stands with the Stark in Winterfell. Command us." The second had been written by an unfamiliar hand. "The others come. Last hearth stands ready." He handed that one over to the Great John, who read it with pleased grunt. Small John's hand. "Good, my son doesn't have cheese in his bloody ears." He looked up. "Lord Stark, House Umber stands ready." And then he leant back in his chair and took a gulp of ale, before looking intently at the little mound of stone arrowheads that they had taken from the rotted bag in the secret room. "Why do those fascinate you so much?" Ned asked. "Because they remind me of the last hearth. I used to pick up arrowheads like this as a lad when I was walking around the north walls. There's a rocky patch there. And the lower tunnels still have areas where you can mine these things as well. Most odd." Ned went still as something that the Great John had said on his arrival suddenly returned to him. Great John, you said that the last hearth was named by my ancestors and that it was built on a crag. Did that crag have a name? The big man frowned. Aye, he said thoughtfully. T was the glittering crag. Why? Ned closed his eyes for a moment and suppressed the need to swear. Because the records we found there mentioned the glittering crag and said that there had been a great siege there, that led to the others being routed. Do you know anything of that? Oh, the Great John said with a sigh. There was a great siege there and a lot of men died. There's a place to the south called the Burning where the dead were said to have been cremated. And there are still barrows to the west that we were told never to disturb, not least because nothing grows on them. After the siege was broken, it was then that your ancestor gave the crag to my ancestor and told him to build a fortress there and then to guard it at all costs. Why? Ned asked intently, why that place? At all costs. The Great John blinked at him. I don't rightly know, Ned, he replied. He then winced. We've lost a lot, over the years. All I know was that every year we had to mine the lower crag for rocks to send to Winterfell. But we haven't done that for years, centuries even. He nodded in reply and then frowned at the little mound of arrowheads. Our forefathers must have thought those important. I wonder why. I don't know. Stone can be brittle. The Great John shrugged again. How are your children, by the way? Robb and John were affected as badly as we were by that bloody stone. They all heard it. So did Kat. But whereas she was frightened by it, Arya is still excited at the thought of magic, Bran wants to know more about everything, Sansa is still thinking about it all, and Rickon seems to have taken it all for granted. Ned shook his head. The young adapt better than the old. Knuckles rapped again at the door and then turned to see old Mickon standing there, twisting his cap in his hands. Your pardon, my lords. You asked me to look at the mace you found. Ah, Mickon. Yes, here. And Ned pulled out the huge mace and carried it over to the blacksmith. He had to admit that he liked the way that weapon felt in his hands. It was lighter than it looked somehow and was well balanced. Someone had crafted it most skillfully after much thought. He laid it on the table that had been brought in by the door. What do you make of it? Mickon bent over and peered at it carefully, and then he blinked rapidly and took a longer look at it. Interesting, he breathed quietly as he traced a finger over it. Very interesting. Can I ask where you found this, my lord? In a hidden room. It belonged to my ancestors. Yet it is no steel that I have seen before. Mickon stroked his beard with one hand. I think, he said cautiously, that this is not steel. I think that it is sky metal. Ned looked at the Great John, who stared back in astonishment. Sky metal. I've seen a few old pieces here and there. When stars fall from the sky as rocks, then sometimes they contain metal. And sometimes that metal can be smelted and used. It often looks different. This mace, as you can see, my lord, has no corrosion on it. Not a speck of rust. He paused, as if measure his words. The make of it, the way it has been worked. It is ancient, my lord. Most ancient. This is the work of the first men. No modern mace looks like this. And, well, there were tales of magic being used on such weapons. Magic in the forging. Mickon straightened up. He looked faintly ashamed. We have lost the means to make a weapon like this, my lord. As I look at it, the more I am convinced that magic was used to make it. I can think of no other way that it could be forged. And then he hesitated and seemed to be struggling with something. What is it, Mickon? My lord, every smith in Winterfell has always had tales passed down to him from his predecessor. And there is a dim and distant tale of a great mace that was in the possession of your lord ancestors until they acquired ice. My lord, this might be the Fist of Winter. Ned looked at the mace in some shock. From the tales, he muttered. There were references there to it. He paused. Sky metal. So this is like Dawn, the sword of the Danes. Mickon shrugged. I've never seen Dawn, my lord. But sky metal varies, depending on the color and nature of the star. And what can be done with it also varies. Magic again. Or so the tales say. What of the stones embedded in them? Micken scratched his beard thoughtfully. They look like nothing I have even seen, my lord. But then I am not a maester. Ned nodded and then looked at Micken. Very well, my thanks, Micken. Happy to oblige, my lord, the blacksmith rumbled and then strode out of the door. So that's the Fist of Winter, the great John grunted. I've heard the legends as well. That looks like it's got a lot of weight behind it. A weight of history as well. Ned muttered as he sat again. And then he looked up at the doorway again, having heard footsteps. Lewin then emerged at the doorway puffing as if he had been running. My lord, the old maester wheezed as he approached and held out 2 pieces of paper, messages. Taking them, Ned unrolled the first. Skagos stands with the Stark in Winterfell. This is from Skagos. It is, my lord, Lewin said. And such a thing is rare indeed. Ravens from Skagos are, like hen's teeth. Ned nodded and then opened the second. House Reed stands with the Stark in Winterfell. Lord Reed rides to Winterfell with all dispatch with news of. He paused and then continued, dreams of green seers. Surely that cannot be. Lewin coughed. There was a third raven, my lord. It was from the citadel. The glass candles are relit. Magic has indeed returned to these lands. Oh bugger, great John Umber sighed and then he gulped down yet more ale. Brindon. He was on edge as he strode to the bloody gate, but he knew that he could not show it. The knight of the gate had to be calm and collected and not show nerves. That said, he knew that something, somewhere was very wrong. For one thing, it was far, far too quiet. Normally there was always rumbling in the hills and mountains. The mountain clans were seen moving in the high passes, raiding here, stealing there, murdering when the mood took them and taking away women that took their fancy. They were outlaws, raiders, murderer, rapists and overall scum. But right now they were quieter than he had ever known. Oh, there had still been reports. Something about horns being heard in the high passes. But otherwise it was as if they had vanished into thin air. It was totally unlike them, and that worried him. Worried him a lot. And then there was that other thing. The thing that was also pressing upon his mind. The bloody gate loomed before him and he made a mental note not to pass on his worries to anyone. Then he saw Sir Donal in front of him and his heart sank a little, if for a different reason. The old veteran had that young puppy lordling behind him. The youngest son of Lord Waxel was an incompetent, wet-nosed, brainless little idiot who had a habit of hopping from leg to leg like a small boy in need of the privy in a hurry. Well, Brindon growled. I talked to travellers on the high road. They all reported a quiet journey. Not a sign of the mountain clans. I don't like it, Sir Brindon. I've never heard of such a thing. Young Waxel, who had been jiggling in place, finally opened his mouth. But sirs, the answer is obvious. The scum have finally been scared away by our great prowess and show of arms. Brindon shared a long-suffering glance with Sir Donal. Lad, Brindon rumbled, the mountain clans have been a pain in the ass of the Uri for centuries. I hardly think that they've been scared off by the sight of a new coat of arms on a shield. No, this is something else. But any further discussions was curtailed by the sound of a shout from the gate itself, as a sentry at the tallest part waved at them. Sir Brindon. Riders before the gate. Mountain clans. I knew it, Brindon sighed and then strode off quickly towards the gates, which were already being pulled closed by the men. They were good lads, he had trained them well. As the gates boomed closed, he entered the side gate to one of the towers, followed by Sir Donal and the Waxel pup, and then ran up the spiral stairs. As they emerged from the door on the ramparts, he looked out at the road. Yes, they were there. A group of figures on those small horses of theirs. Well, all but one was mounted. The one that was not seemed to be too large for a horse. Yes, they were mountain clansmen. 10 of them to be precise. And they were all, just sitting there, on their horses. Not doing a damn thing. Out of range of any bowman. Sitting there with the mist rolling down the valley towards them. This is odd, Sir Donal muttered. What are they doing? And then one of them, who was holding a spear, got off his horse and started to walk towards the bloody gate. Halfway there he jammed the butt of the spear into the earth on the side of the road and then took 10 measured paces and then stopped walking. This got the Waxel pup spluttering. He challenges us. What impudence! Sir Brindon, I can get the rope from here with my bow. No, Brindon said with a frown. That is not a challenge. That is a parley. I will treat with him. And then he turned and went swiftly down the stairs to the gates, before borrowing a spear from one of the men-at-arms and then slipping through a small postern gate. Once out he walked along the road, counting, until he reached the spot he had measured with his eyes from the ramparts. There he thrust the butt of his own spear in the ground and then marched 10 paces forwards, taking off his wrist braces as he did and then pulling up the chainmail and leather on the forearm of his sleeve. The clansman, who was as grey as he was and dressed in the usual mismatched armour of the mountain clans, was also busy rolling back his sleeve. When he was done he nodded at Brindon and then strode forwards and clasped forearms with him, skin to skin. No hidden arms, said the clansman. No hidden arms, Brindon agreed, before they both stepped back and replaced their sleeves. You are the Blackfish, the clansman said almost cheerily. It would be an honor to kill you. I am Rhys, son of Dana. I am the Blackfish and you are the head of the Sons of the Tree, Brindon said, feeling intrigued. What was he doing here? They normally ranged far to the northwest. I am that. The clansman stuck his thumbs in his belt and then looked at Brindon somberly. We come here to bear witness. To warn you. Your clan. Rhys sighed and then jerked a thumb at the group behind him. All the clans. We lead them. Ice seemed to trickle up and down his spine for an instant. All the clans. They were all there. He peered at them. The large man had 2 axes strapped to his back and another at his belt. He seemed to like axes. And one seemed to be a woman. Yes, they could well be the leaders of the mountain clans. To warn us about what? Why, that we shall return. That in our absence you shall not think that you have won the long war, or that you send men to drive out those that shall remain to guard our lands. Brindon ran his words through his head, wondered if he had gone mad and then asked the one question that the situation demanded, what? Rhys ran a hand through his beard and sighed. When he looked up, Brindon recognized the look in the eyes of the man. It was the look of a man who thought that he might die at some point. We are summoned, he said almost gently. We have all felt the call. The old blood is strong in us and we heed what it tells us. So we come here with a summons and a warning. The summons is for us. We are needed in the north. The warning is for you. We will return. And when we do, the Age of Heroes will return and we will have it all back, Blackfish. Tell the Arin we will have it all again. It will be our payment. Payment? And what do you mean, you are going to the north? Why? This brought him a pitying look. Ah, you have rocks in your ears. You did not hear it. Rhys smiled a strange and terrible smile. The others have returned, Blackfish. We have heard the call. Shock roiled through him. What call is this? Rhys looked at him. It came days ago. The others come. The Stark. Brindon Tully interrupted him. The Stark calls for aid. You are needed. The clansman opened his eyes at that. And then he smiled hugely. Saha. So the old blood is strong in you too, Blackfish. You have heard the call as well, your ancestors must have been mighty indeed. Perhaps we will fight together on the wall. The smile faded. Many of us will die. But it will be a good death. Many new songs will be sung about us. But it will be worth it. We remember, you see. We remember. He said the words with a curious intensity. 'Tis a curse and a blessing. This was madness. But he remembered the voice he had heard, remembered the feeling that it had sparked within him. He swallowed thickly. But, the others have been gone for thousands of years. A shrug from the clansman. Seasons turn. Winter is coming. The long night returns and with it the dreams. In the stars the bottom of the crook can be seen for the first time in memory, as it was foretold. They come, Blackfish. They come. We march. But tell the Arin that we will be back. And then he turned and strode off, wrenching the spear out of the ground as he left. Brindon took a step towards him. Wait. You go north. How? Rhys waved a hand over his shoulder as he walked away. Secret ways, Blackfish, he called over his shoulder, secret ways. And then the mist rolled in and he was gone. Jorah. He liked Myr, even though it was too hot for his blood. Everywhere in Essos was too hot. He was of the north, of Bear Island, and as he lay in bed and stared at the ceiling he thought of home for a long moment, before closing his eyes in anguish for a moment. The thought of the trees and the steep hills, the little villages on the coastline, the fog that wreathed the island. He thrust the memories away before they could choke him with grief yet again, and then slipped out of bed, leaving the girl sleeping on her side of it. What was her name again? Oh yes, Lyra. A sweet girl with a warm smile and a liking for him, given by the number of times she was available for him. He smiled at her slumbering form for a moment and then walked quietly to the chair and threw on a robe, before crossing to the window. Myr. The city that people, men and women, never really slept. There was always something being made somewhere, or planned, or even thought up and then discussed very, very loudly. He often wondered if the citadel at Old Town was like this place. Possibly it was Lesder when inspiration struck. He grabbed a chair from one side and then carefully placed it so the noise did not wake Lyra, before sitting in it and then running his hands through his hair. The letter from Varys had been clear: he was to go to Pentos and spy on the beggar king there. Pentos. He loathed that place. In Myr there were at least ideas and a slightly frenetic optimism. Pentos. It was riddled with cynicism and ruthless ambition. Trade was everything. And anything could be traded there. But why was the beggar king there? For what purpose? Apparently he and his sister were in the house of one of the magisters of the city, one Iliomapatis. He'd asked about the man. He was extremely rich and powerful and apparently wasn't a man who liked fools. So why take in the beggar king? Viserys Targaryen was penniless, proud, desperate and increasingly unstable. Given who his father had been, the instability wasn't that surprising. In his case the apple had not only not fallen far from the tree, but had nestled against the trunk. No, Varys was right, something was indeed going on there. So he would have to leave Myr and travel north, to that city filled with men with deep pockets and naught but greed in their eyes. His own eyes flickered to the northwest. The pull of home was strong today. It grew stronger with every day that passed now, ever since the night that he'd come awake with a shout, startling Lyra. It had been an intense dream. That voice. He felt the call of home. And yet home was denied him. He ran a hand over his chin and resolved to shave that day. He preferred to be clean-shaven here. Beards could be too sweaty otherwise. He thought of his father and the old man's great beard and then smiled slightly before the smile ebbed. Home. Jorah. He turned to the bed and smiled in reassurance. Lyra was looking at him sleepily, hair tousled and one breast exposed. I did not want to disturb you, he said softly. Tea's morning. She smiled at him and then pulled the sheet down to show the other breast. Come back to bed. He smiled back and then obeyed her command. Pentos awaited. Perhaps she would come with him. But the north still called. Asher. There was a dead man in the gibbet on the end of the breakwater at Lordsport. Asher stared at the corpse as the black wind passed it. Whoever he was, he had not died well. His arms were bound behind him and what appeared to be wooden stakes had been hammered into his eyes. He hadn't been there when they'd left and her men did not like the way this greeted them on their return. Many turned their heads and spat to ward off evil. As they made the ship fast to the pier, Haakon nudged her. Look yonder. She looked and then blinked. She knew that ship, and that flag. The sea song, she breathed, and then as soon as the ship was moored properly she leapt over the side. Feed the men, I have to see mine uncle, she called over her shoulder and then acknowledged Haelen's wave of acknowledgement with one of her own. She had to admit that she was troubled as she strode over the stone quay and over to her uncle Roderick's ship. Perhaps he would have sound counsel for her. But he was not there. Instead his sailing master Dale was standing by the gangplank, one hand on his sword and a deeply worried look on his face. He brightened when he saw her though, enough to crack a smile and joke about her hair. But then he stared at the castle. Your uncle has gone to see your father, he said grimly. And Lord Harlaw is, well, troubled. Asher nodded and then she noticed the air of tension about the crew. The Sea Song looked as if it was ready to sail at a moment's notice. Dale, what is wrong? But the man had never been a very eloquent or talkative man, and all she got from him was some hemming and hawing, before an entreaty to go to the castle and see if Lord Harlaw was all right, that he had been gone for too long. And so Asher finally nodded and left for Pike. The wind was blowing hard by the time she made it into the tower where her father's solar was situated, and she stopped to sniff it. There was more rain in that wind, and it was veering to the southeast again. There might be a storm on the way. She shrugged and then opened the door and strode down the corridor. And then she heard the voices. The guards outside the solar looked nervous and on edge, and when she identified the voices she knew why. Uncle Roderick and father were both in there, as was Uncle Aaron. Damfair himself was in there, and she shuddered a little. He had been a very different man since his near drowning, colder than the sea and as devout as any drowned man could ever be, and sometimes even more so. The guard saw her and nodded at her as she reached for the door, only to have it opened in front of her. Uncle Roderick stormed out and very nearly collided with her, changing course at the last moment. He looked as angry as she had ever seen him, and beneath that anger was worry. His eyes widened as he realized who he had nearly knocked over, and then he strode away down the corridor, although not before whispering, "I sail on the tide. See me before." She watched him go with a frown of puzzlement, and then she turned back to the solar, only to see Damfair stride out. He looked at her, narrowed his eyes slightly, and then left down a different corridor, and she stared after him. There had been something about him that set her teeth on edge. There had been a set to his shoulders and a glitter in his eyes, almost amounting to a look of ecstasy, that worried him. Father was staring out of the window of his solar and only looked around when she closed the door. He looked preoccupied, with a scowl on his face. "Asher," he said eventually. "You are back early." "I had to return," she said. "I felt." Father forestalled her by scowling even more and holding up a hand. "Speak not of it. It was Greenlander mummery." Asher stared at her father in astonishment. "Father, we were at sea. Half my crew heard it and the other half felt it, or felt something at least." "Speak of it not." Father roared at her, and she took a step back before father rubbed at his forehead and then waved a hand in a semi-apology. "I have had your Uncle Roderick in there from an early hour." The reader spoke nonsense. "I fear he is addled in his head. Anyway, Aaron was here and he explained everything. 'Twas naught but a Greenlander mummery, as the drowned god denied this call to the north. We are to pay it no mind." Asher opened her mouth to passionately argue against this, but then she caught the fire in father's eye. Now was not the time. Not with his memory so fresh with Uncle Roderick's sanity and Uncle Aaron's madness. No, she had a good idea about what was going on here. So she nodded sharply and then passed back out through the castle, noting absently that the storm was indeed building but that it might pass to the west. And then down to Lord Sport, where she found her sane uncle pacing about on the quay by his ship. "Asher," he greeted her. "Let me guess, your father claimed mummery of some type." "He did. But I heard it, nuncle. I heard it as clear as I hear you. The others come. The Stark in Winterfell needs us." She shook her head, bewildered. "How can father deny it? My own crew feel it." "I know, little one," he said, another sign that he was very worried. "I know. It was strong at Harlaw. But your father," Uncle Roderick looked about carefully and then lowered his voice. "Your lord father hates the North and the Starks for their role in the suppression of his rebellion. For the death of your brothers. To admit that he has felt the call to aid them. He cannot do that. Even if the threat is from the others. He simply claims that the others are no threat to the Ironborn, even if the others even still exist and are not some tale told by old women in the North." His face set slightly. "And then there is your Uncle Aaron. Damfair will never admit to hearing that call. Never. To do so means admitting to the existence of the old gods and to acknowledging that we are linked to the first men. Drowned men claim that we were made by the drowned god. To your father and your uncle, admitting that they heard the call to the north to aid the Stark means that the old way is weakened. And that is something that they cannot abide." Asher thought it through and then sighed. "So what shall we do?" "We watch and we wait and we keep our mouths shut." Uncle Roderick gestured at the breakwater. "Do you see that man out there?" "Aye. He traded with the North a lot. He heard the call and talked about the old gods in earshot of Damfair. So your uncle had him bound and then hammered stakes whittled from weirwood driftwood into his eyes until he died. Damn fair will deny everything and kill anyone who contradicts him. So I will sail back to Harlaw and I will read my books and do my research and protect my people. Because foul things are coming from the north, Asher, winter comes. And with it, death. Don't be on pike when it comes, niece. Because the drowned god, he paused for a long moment and then sighed. The call to Winterfell is louder. Oberyn. The water gardens were still as lovely as they had ever been, he thought as he strolled down the little path. There were flowering herb bushes to each side of him and as he passed down the path he could hear the contented buzzing from the bees as they harvested the pollen around them. As he walked he thought, and as he thought he did his best not to frown too much. Life was always a series of challenges and tests. Although the past few days had been confusing, he had always had an ear for gossip and news and other things. But recently, it had been odd even by his definition of the word. He found his brother sitting quietly in his wheeled chair overlooking the most beautiful part of the water gardens. "My prince," he said formally, before nodding at him. "How are you today, brother?" Doran smiled slightly. "Tolerable," he said quietly, which was as good as he ever admitted. "And you, Oberyn?" He sat on a nearby bench and clasped his hands for a moment as he thought through everything in his head. Brother Doran broke in, "You are troubled. I can see it." "What is wrong?" Oberyn winced a little. "Nothing I can put my finger on, brother. Just oddness. There have been a few ravens with peculiar messages. Activity in the citadel at Old Town. Robert Baratheon vanishing from King's Landing. And," he sighed a little, "apparently the Company of the Rose is acting oddly in Bravos." "The Sellsword Company?" Doran asked with a frown. "Oddly how?" He leant back on the bench and scowled slightly. "Apparently they turned down a major contract to fight some lunatic bandits that were bothering some Bravo sea merchants. And apparently they have been negotiating with shipping factors about a trip westwards. I have not heard where to exactly yet. But I am concerned." Doran looked at him. "Odd activity amongst sellswords. Does this threaten our enterprise?" He thought about it for a long moment. "It might. Sellswords will be needed at some point. And I like sellswords to be predictable. When they are not, well, I will find out more." Doran nodded slowly as he looked out at the sea in the distance. "And this news of Baratheon vanishing is also odd." He went to Storm's End. "There is no word yet on why." Another nod. A moment of silence fell as they both stared into the distance. And then Oberyn looked to one side as he heard the thump of boots. Aereo Hotter was striding towards them, a slight frown on his face. He stopped not too far away and bowed formally. "My prince," he said quietly to Doran. "Prince Oberyn. I crave your pardon, but an unannounced visitor asks for an urgent meeting." He saw his brother sigh tiredly. He did not like people to see him in his wheelchair. The Prince of Dawn wanted to be in his palace in Sunspear, not being an invalid in the water gardens. "Who is it, Hotter?" The big man coughed slightly. "Lord Alsterdane, my prince." Oberyn exchanged a startled look with his brother. "I thought that he was supposed to be dying at Starfall." "It would seem that he has roused himself from his deathbed," Brother Doran said, looking fascinated. "He would not have come unless it was for a very good reason." "Very well, Hotter, let him through." The captain of the guard bowed and then swept away, before returning with a smaller man dressed in riding garb that looked as if it had taken a lot of usage recently. He bowed to them both and then swayed slightly. "Lord Dane, be seated," Doran said, leaning forward slightly in concern. Oberyn cast an eye over the man. He did not look well, with a face that was drawn and pale from more than just travel. His eyes seemed a little sunken and there was a look to him that told of weariness beyond words. "Thank you, my prince," Lord Dane said hoarsely, and Oberyn reached to one side and poured a cup of wine for the man from the table to one side. "And thank you, Prince Oberyn," he muttered and drank without hesitation. Oberyn smirked slightly inside. Normally he would say that it was a brave man who took anything to eat or drink from the Red Viper of Dawn. In this case caution was not needed. Once the Lord of Starfall had finished drinking he lowered the cup and smiled. My apologies for my attire. I have been traveling in a hurry and will leave for Sustone as soon as possible. But I had to see you first. For what reason? Doran asked the question with a slight frown on his face. Lord Dane's face worked for a moment and then he sighed. I am called North, my prince. It is hard to explain. Doran's frown intensified. You are called North. Where? Have you been summoned to King's Landing? No, Dane sighed. I am not. I am called further north than that, but it is very hard to explain, my prince. It is something that the stony Dornish understand and are dealing with, without I think understanding it, because they do not remember, and he swayed slightly and Oberyn watched him in concern. But then Lord Alster Dane collected himself, took a deep breath and then looked up and Oberyn saw something in those violet eyes that made him blink. There was an iron determination there, and a need to be somewhere else. Your pardon, my prince, I have not been well of late. But then, my prince, House Dane is one of the oldest families in Dorne. We are of the first men, their blood sings within us. And echoes of older times. One such echo has awoken. As the head of House Dane I am called to the north. To Winterfell. To Oberyn this was pure gibberish and he looked at the other man in some concern. Lord Dane, he said, with a sideways glance at his frowning brother, have you seen a maester of late? Dane smiled mirthlessly. I am quite sane, Prince Oberyn. It is just that, you are familiar with the ancestral sword of my house, Dorne. He thought back to the last time he had seen the sword, born in the hands of Arthur Dane, the last sword of the morning that House Dane had produced. Dead now these many years, killed by Ned Stark. He had always admired that sword. It had a sheen that was unlike anything he had ever seen. I remember it, he said. What of it? It is restless. Dane said the last word with a strange intensity. It pulls me north. And I must go. I am not a well man. This might be my last trip. But north I must go. I will send word to King's Landing, where he paused for a moment to drink some more wine. My son Edric is telling him to join me at Winterfell. There was a long moment of silence. Then Oberyn looked at his brother, before turning back to Dane. Lord Dane, he said delicately, swords are not usually described as being restless. The stony Dornishman nodded. I know, Prince Oberyn. As I said, it is hard to understand. Perhaps if you observed it I left it with your captain. If he could bring it forwards. This was something else that made Oberyn blink. I thought that Dorne was to remain at Starfall, until another sword of the morning was selected. This is too urgent. It cannot wait for that. Dane said the words grimly. It travels north with me. Its pull takes me north. Oberyn looked over at his brother and was about to ask him to send this dying lunatic man away when he saw a look on Doran's face that made him pause. What, brother? Something our father once told us, and which I will tell you later, Doran muttered, before raising his voice. Very well. Hotter. My prince. Bring Dorne to us. The big man nodded and then walked off to one side. When he returned into view he looked troubled. He was also carrying a great sword in a sheath bound with red leather. Oberyn nodded slightly as he looked at the hilt and the odd sheen. Yes, that was Dorne. Hotter approached and then knelt before them. He seemed to be sweating a little. Dorne, my prince, he said hoarsely. Prince Oberyn, Lord Dane said quietly, please touch the hilt. Oberyn almost rolled his eyes at this, but he was still wondering why Hotter looked as if he had seen a ghost and he squinted carefully at the hilt. Nothing looked suspicious there, before touching it with a languid hand. And then he leapt to his feet with a stifled oath. By the seven. It's quivering. Yes, Prince Oberyn, Hotter said in a voice that said that he wanted to drop the damn thing and then have no more of it. It is. Doran rubbed his chin for a moment and then reached out a single finger, which he placed on the hilt. When he lifted it again he was pale. Indeed it does. He looked back at Dane. Do you know what calls you north? Dane looked at him. I do, he said in a grim voice. I do not think that I will ever return, save to the crypt at Starfall. And even now I do not think that you would ever believe me when I say what is there. But there are dark things in the north. Things that the south must be protected from. And so I go back to my kin in the north. The Lord of Starfall stood slowly and then looked about the water gardens. A very beautiful place in the sun, he smiled. And then the smile faded. Farewell, my prince. He gently took the sword out of the hands of Hotter, who sighed in relief, and then Lord Dane walked away tiredly. Brother Doran said slowly, can you please send a raven to the citadel to ask if the glass candles can be lit? I will send that raven at once. And then Oberyn ran. Robert. There was a storm coming. There was always a bloody storm coming, that was why his ancestors had named the fucking place Storm's End. He looked out over the ramparts of the massive curtain wall at the horizon, before looking back at the great tower with a skull. He hadn't the faintest bloody idea why he was here, in this, the seat of his ancestors. All he knew was that he'd woken up in the middle of the night with a sudden need to head off to his family seat. And on the sea journey south that call had gotten worse and had then been joined by another call, this time to go off in the opposite direction. He turned back to the sea and scowled again. What the hell was wrong with him? Why was he dithering around like an old woman? What was here to make him come in the first place? He didn't know. The first day had been bad enough. He and Renly had burst in on an astonished Sir Courtenay Penrose, the castellan that his brother had appointed and whom Robert had to admit wasn't doing a bad job. Robert had spent just long enough to bath and break his fast, before raging around the castle, inspecting it with his brother and Barristan Selmy right behind him, both a bit bewildered. He knew that he was looking for something. The problem was that he hadn't the faintest bloody idea what it was, where it was, or how to find it. He just knew that it was here somewhere. The second day was worse, as he continued to rage around the castle, with many people doing their damnedest to avoid him, even young Edric who he had noticed peering around walls trying to catch a look at his father. He liked the boy, but he had no time for him just now, no time for anything. He had to work out why he was here. And now it was the third day and he was still nowhere near working out why he was fucking here. He scratched at his beard again and then frowned. Sod the beard, he needed to get it shaved off completely. And then he looked at his belly in disgust. He was fat. When had he gotten fat? How had he gotten fat? Was it all that bloody city and that damn chair? He set his chin. Right then. A shave and then a sparring session. With who? He needed to lose this damn fat. So he turned and clattered down the nearest steps off the wall and down to the green of the grassy expanse that lay to the west of the great tower. And then he paused and frowned. There was a little sapling growing out of the grass, its leaves poking up tentatively into the sky. Robert walked up to it and then bent over to look at it. By the 7, it was a weirwood tree. He looked about the place. What the hell was a weirwood tree doing growing here? And then he thought about it. His ancestor Doran had built this place, possibly with the help of Bran the Builder. So there must have been a godswood here once. Hundreds of bloody years ago. Where the hell had this thing come from? Your Grace. Selmy asked behind him and he pointed at the delicate little thing. A weirwood sapling, he muttered. I don't remember ever seeing any of those before. The Lord Commander of the King's Guard looked over at it. Perhaps it came from a seed dropped by a bird. Weirwood trees have small seeds. Perhaps, Robert mused. The little sapling reminded him of the north and of Lyanna. There were times when he could barely remember what she looked like and he made a vow to visit her grave soon. There would be a statue of her by it, a reminder of what she looked like. She wouldn't have let him get fat, not his she-wolf. Oh, said a fussy voice to one side and he looked up to see the Septon, a thin streak of piss whose name escaped him, bustling up to them and sneering at the sapling. Another one of those things. If your Grace will allow me, I shall remove it. As he reached down, Robert placed a large hand on his arm. Wait. You said it was another one. There have been more of these. The Septon blinked at him. Why, yes, your Grace. There have been several of them. They started growing about 10 days ago. Robert looked down at the sapling. That was about the time that he had left King's Landing. Odd, he growled, before looking at the Septon. Leave it. 'Tis but a tree. This seemed to aggrieve the Septon, given the violence of the gabbling that followed. But your grace. It's a pagan symbol. The seven will frown on the presence of such a thing here. Then why, Robert said through gritted teeth, do the seven still permit weirwood trees in the north? The septon seemed to do his best to look censorious. It was not a good look for a man who appeared to have no chin and a very large nose. The pagans of the north, your grace, he started to say, are uncouth and. Given that the tale of how Robert had gained the throne must have been told in Storm's End more times than he'd had horse, the man must have been mad. Robert grabbed by his robes and hoisted him into the air. My beloved Lionel came from the north, you little piece of filth. Robert roared at the man as he shook him like a rat. And my friend Ned is the warden of the north and the finest man I've ever known. Uncouth. I'll uncouth you right in the face, you bastard. The septon was squealing what appeared to be a combination of apology, cry for help and appeal to the seven, and Robert glared at him, before giving him one last shake and then dropping him on his ass away from the sapling. The man cowered before him, before noticing that they had an audience, whereupon he shakily stood. Robert loomed over him and narrowed his eyes. If anything happens to that weirwood planterling, he ground out, I will know exactly who to blame you. And I will personally spread your nose clean over your face. Now bugger off. Visibly glad to still be alive, the septon gave a ghastly attempt at a grin and then vanished like the little fart that he was. Robert watched him go and then stomped off back to the great keep, where he had that shave. And then, once his face was bare, he waved a hand at Renly. Come on, grab some practice swords. I worry that all that time in the Reach is making you soft. Robert, his youngest brother, said with a laugh, I joust. I know, but I worry that you forget that real war consists of men on foot clattering away at each other until one falls over and leaks his guts out. So we will spar. And spar they did. Renly wasn't as bad as he had feared, but not as good as he obviously thought he was, and Robert beat him down twice before finally breaking his practice sword. You're getting soft, Robert panted as he stood over his brother and then offered him his hand. Robert, Renly replied as he pulled himself up, what's going on? Why are we here? What are we looking for? And what's this talk of war? You can't feel it then. Feel what? Robert clenched and unclenched his hand. I don't know. And that holds for all your questions. Something pulled me here, Renly. I don't know what. And there is a war coming. I can feel it on my blood and in my bones. I just don't know who we'll be fighting. You really don't feel it? Renly frowned and then pulled a face. I have felt restless this past 10 days. As if I need to look over my shoulder. Then he paused and nodded slightly. We have an audience. He turned to look and then saw young Edric watching them, his mouth open with wonder. He was carrying a little warhammer. He smiled slightly and then beckoned his bastard son over. Come here and let me have a look at that boy. Edric approached, looking nervous. I am sorry, your grace, but I saw you practicing and I. You were curious, lad. Don't worry, it's in your blood. He reached out and gently took up the little warhammer. A good first weapon. Penrose training you with it? The boy nodded eagerly. Sir Courtenay has been instructing me with it, your grace. I'm your father, lad, you can call me that instead of all this your grace stuff, Robert rumbled, before handing it back. Come on then. Let's see you use it. And the boy did know how to use it. He had the makings of good warrior, blessed with good reflexes and a quick mind. He learned fast, picking up Robert's barked instructions and warnings and not having his head turned by any praise. They ended the session when Edric was dropping with exhaustion, as Robert nodded at Sir Courtenay as the yawning lad was led away by a smiling guard. You've done well, he smiled. He's a good lad. He is that, your grace, the red-bearded man said with a smile. He's clever and knows when to ask questions and when to stop and listen. Looks like me too, he said with a grin, and then he paused as his stomach rumbled. Supper calls. Ale too. He ate just enough and drank just enough that evening, because all of a sudden he was so tired that he almost fell asleep in his chair. It was a good tiredness, a tiredness in every limb that came from exercise, and he fell into bed and was asleep in an instant. The storm came that night, the kind of storm he remembered from his childhood. But the dreams had him first, the dreams that this time he remembered. He dreamt of Lionel for the first time in years, and this time she was just as he remembered her. She seemed to be trying to tell him something, shouting against a great wind that seemed to snatch her words away. She looked terrified, as if she was pleading him for something, but he couldn't get close to make her words out. There were weirwood trees there too, at first far behind them, but then suddenly they rushed towards them and then they were in them, the trunks around them. He lost her then, as if she had been snatched away, and he screamed with frustration and ran through the ghostly wood around him. There was snow on the ground all of a sudden and his breath smoked as he panted. And then he entered a clearing and a thing with white hair and bright blue eyes that shone like stars stared at him with some surprise. He came awake with a shout and then blinked muzzily about him. And then there was a boom of thunder right above him and the room shook slightly. Yes, the storm had come. He lay back in bed, his chest heaving as he panted. What had that dream been about? What had she been trying to tell him? And what had been that thing? More thunder and then a strange, irrational feeling came over him. Suddenly he was terrified for that little weirwood sapling. There was thunder and lightning and torrential rain outside, and would it survive? So he stood and dressed hurriedly before darting out of his room and then out into the night. The rain was falling hard and yet more lightning cracked across the sky, followed by the boom of thunder. He hurried across the wet grass and then he saw the other figure, the one cloaked and hooded from the rain and also heading towards the sapling. He eyed the figure and then he sped up. There was a horrible intent in the way that figure was stalking. He was right. The figure ahead was peering at the ground and then it stopped dead and tilted its head at something, before raising a foot. But Robert hurled himself forwards before the other man could get a chance to stamp on the sapling, grabbing the bastard and pulling him off to one side. The other man let out a shout of shock and Robert snarled in fury as he recognized the voice. Sure enough, the hood fell down to reveal the Septon, who snarled at him and then recognized him and by the smell of it pissed himself in terror. Robert's fist came back and down and he felt the Septon's nose break with a wet crack as he smeared it across the other man's face. Blood spurted all over the place and then as the other man squealed in anguish, Robert brought his blooded fist around again and caught him on the side of the head, knocking him senseless. "You leave Lionel's fucking tree alone!" Robert screamed as the thunder boomed around them, in what he later admitted to himself was a deeply nonsensical statement. And then he straightened up and searched the ground carefully. The last thing he wanted was to step on the thing. No, there it was, still upright. A bit bloody perhaps from the Septon's nose, but intact and none the worse from the weather. He nodded and then knelt by it, before touching the little leaves gently and... It was dark down here. No, black. Pitch black. Water was falling somewhere, dripping slowly down. Where was he? Underground. Yes. And he was being watched. Who was there, in that darkness? That deep, smothering darkness. He quivered. It was here. What he sought was here and... Your Grace. Are you well? He looked up, startled. The rain was slowing and the Septon was stirring. Barristan Selmy was next to him, looking worried. Selmy. What's wrong? I should say the same thing to you, Your Grace. You were motionless. What happened? He could see Renly approaching and also Penrose and young Edric, the latter yawning as if he was about to fall asleep in an instant again. Robert looked down at the Septon. I woke up odd dreams, he said thickly. I was worried for some reason. Came out and found this bastard about to stamp on the weirwood tree. He was probably going to blame it on the storm. I got to him first and then swatted him. Penrose, get some guards to throw him in the nearest cell. Septon or not, I want him gone. I never liked him, Renly muttered. Man always thought that the way to piety was to point out everyone else's flaws. They all watched as the guards arrived and dragged the suddenly awake and piteously squealing man away. Something happened when I touched the weirwood tree, Robert said slowly. I was underground suddenly. Young Edric's head whipped around as his son stared at him, his face very white. Robert looked back at him. Edric, he said seriously, has that happened to you too? His bastard son nodded, slowly. The first time I saw it. I touched the leaf and... I was somewhere dark. There was water dripping. And... I did not imagine it, I swear, but I thought that I was being watched. He smiled. Yes, this lad was his son. Then he paused. Penrose, bring me maps, plans, everything you have on the catacombs of Storm's End. I have been searching for something. I think that it lies not up here but beneath us. An hour later, if he had thought that he had known every inch of the tunnels beneath Storm's End before, he knew even more now. And there was indeed a tunnel that led in the direction of where the old godswood must have been, the long passage. But there was a problem. There's nothing bloody down here, he said disgustedly as he and Renly stood at the end of it and stared at a stone wall. Although I remember a lot of crates of old pickled herring here once, when I hid as a child. Plus there are a lot fewer rats. We ate most of them, Renly muttered quietly. Robert, during the siege Stannis had the entire castle searched from end to end for food. He found nothing down here. But what's the point of the long passage, anyway? It doesn't lead anywhere. There are no side passages, or bricked-up entrances to rooms. What was it for? This brought him a shrug from his brother. Who knows? Perhaps it was stopped before it was completed. No, there's something down here, I know it. Footsteps sound behind them and they turned to see Edric and Penrose coming towards them, the latter counting under his breath. When they reached them, the Castellan looked at them both, his eyes shining. Your Grace, I have paced it out. The end of this passage is not under the place where the tree grows, it is short of it by at least 60 feet. I was right, Robert cried, exulted. There is something down here. He turned to the wall. It must be behind here. Your Grace, Edric piped up to one side. The walls to each side are laid stone on stone. The wall at the end is laid stone on mortar on stone. They are similar stones but different build. He squinted at the wall. Well spotted, lad, he said and ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. Need a knife? Let's take a look. Edric's right, Renly mused as he pulled a knife out and poked at the mortar. And shoddy mortar at that. This was built in a hurry. Then it can be demolished in a hurry, Robert muttered as he grabbed a knife proffered by Penrose and started to scrape the mortar away. Although the Castellan offered to get men to do this, Robert and his brother, the latter now at last filled with excitement, shrugged off the offer of help and instead worked on breaking down the wall. As the mortar was removed, and young Edric was also helping, the chance came for Robert to get a grip on one stone and pull as hard as he could. Fat or not, he still had some strength. He could feel the sinews strain and the muscles burn, but the first stone came out of the wall with a screeching groan and he tossed it to one side. And where that stone had been was a void, black as night. Wait, Your Grace, Selmy said urgently behind them. Test the air first with a torch. It might be foul. That was good counsel, and he nodded at the old Kingsguard respectfully before placing the proffered torch near the hole. It dipped and flickered for a moment and he nodded. Let's clear the rest of this thing carefully. Stone by stone. Men were called and he and Renly worked at taking the wall down and handing each stone back, so that they could be passed back down the corridor. By the time they were finished, the wall was gone and in its place was the continuation of the corridor, albeit covered in dust. Robert swallowed as he took a tentative step into it. Who knew who had last walked down there? Not he nor any man alive, he would wager good coin on that. And then his eyes widened as he saw that the passageway ended in a great stone door, with a massive lintel over the top, etched with runes. Those are the runes of the first men, he breathed as he looked at them. Fetch Maester Joan. Maester Joan was, it turned out, not far away as he had just awoken and was afire with curiosity at the new discovery. The man arrived almost at a dead run, and then stared up at the runes, his hands shaking as he held his torch up and traced the shapes out. When he was finished he stepped back, white as a sheet. Well? Robert barked. What do they say? Your Grace, the older man quavered, before he rallied. Your Grace, your ancestors lie within. The inscription reads, House Durandon sleeps here, awaiting the call to fight the long night. Robert looked at the stone door for a long moment. And then he walked up to it and with a trembling hand of his own he pushed at the right-hand side of it. It resisted him at first and then he felt it give a little. So he pushed harder. Whoever had built it had done a bloody good job, because it pivoted slowly on the left-hand side. Once it was open he retreated back into the corridor and then waved his torch at the entrance. Nothing happened to the flame, so he shrugged and then walked in slowly. It was a great room, with a stone ceiling supported by great pillars cut from the living rock. He frowned at that and that stared at the walls. Sheer rock as well. What is this place? How old is this place? He muttered. Robert said a stunned Renly to one side. Look. And then he saw the tombs. They were everywhere cut into the sides of the walls with inscriptions saying who they were, some in stone coffins that marched in lines parallel to the walls and some even buried in slots cut in the floor. I always wondered where the Durandons were buried, he breathed as he looked about. Then he frowned. But why were they hidden? Edric, stay back, Penrose called out, but as Robert looked he could see that the boy was walking forwards anyway. From the light of the torch he carried he could see that Edric's face was blank of all thought. He passed down the line of tombs and then stood before an alcove that lay at the far end, dark and mysterious. When the lad reached the alcove he turned and faced him. Father, he said in a strange voice, as if others were speaking through him, it is here. This is the place you seek. The old gods are strong here. The dead have not forgotten them. And then he quietly folded up and collapsed. He darted forwards at the same time as Penrose and Renly, but being closer he got there first. His son was unhurt, but seemed to be asleep and he passed him gently to the Castellan. Get my son to bed, he told the man quietly. He has had a long day already. And then he turned to the alcove. Silence fell after Penrose's feet had passed away and he could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere. He shivered slightly. Yes, this was the place. He walked forward slowly, Renly by him, and as they approached he could see the alcove better by their torchlight. There was a statue there, a man dressed in archaic armor with a huge great sword of archaic design in his hands. More runes were carved into the wall by the statue. Joan. The maester stumbled forwards, tongue-tied by everything around him, and then he stopped and stared at the inscription. Oh. Your Grace. It says, the long night will come again. The Durandons must always stand against it. Ours is the fury, ours is the storm. Because the others will come again. The house motto, Robert muttered. Ours in the fury. So this is where it comes from. And then he paused. The statue and the sword seemed to be different. But the others are a northern myth, Renly objected, although his voice wobbled up and down more than a bit. Are you sure about that, brother? Robert muttered. And then he passed his torch over. Here, hold this. Why? That sword. It's that sword. He stepped forwards and then laid a reverent hand on the hilt where it met the hands of the statue. As he pulled it, it moved and he placed both hands around the grip. And then he felt a tremor run through him, and then the eyes of the statue seemed to open to reveal orbs of red fire, before a voice seemed to roar in his head, Storm King. He shook like a leaf but retained his grip. He sensed Renly stumbling backwards and Selmy letting out a cry of alarm and then darting forwards. Hold, he said thickly. I am Robert, descendant of the Durandons. I am king. The eyes looked at him. Then go north, Storm King. Go north. The eyes closed, the sword fell into his hands, and then he found himself falling backwards, to be caught by Joan and Barristan Selmy. Bugger me, Robert said, and then he passed out. Chapter 6. Chapter text. Alera. She found him on the great rock at the anvil, the northernmost point of the island. Her husband was staring north at the sea with an odd look on his face, the look of man undecided and uncertain. She ran a hand over her swollen stomach. She knew what kept him here, just as she also knew what was pulling him north. Things that she did not understand were in motion, and she wanted to cry for a moment. Why couldn't things be as they had been? Why did the world have to be the way that it was? But then she calmed herself and took a deep breath. Here you are, she said. I knew you'd be here. He turned as if he had known she was there and then gave her that dazzling smile that still made her stomach turn over. He was wearing his white eye patch today, the one that hid most of the scar that split one eyebrow and then marked his cheek. I was watching the waves, he said teasingly. Then the smile slipped and his looked north again. I am drawn away and I don't really know why. I have a suspicion, she said quietly. Mother sent a message. The mirror is clearer. You know what that means. And, danger grows to the north. Her husband looked at him in some shock, before looking at the ground in contemplation. I feared that he said hoarsely. I am pulled there, Alera. I am pulled there. She strode to his side, placed her hands on both sides of his face and kissed him fiercely. I know, I know. Just promise that you will come back. He kissed back passionately and then placed a hand on her belly. Always, he said intently. Always. And then he smirked slightly. Besides, our hall is still half built even now. She rolled her eyes at this. You and your hall. It will never be big enough for you, will it? He ran a hand down the side of her face. It is home, he said simply. It has you. And our children. And our children to be. So, yes, I may be pulled north, but I will always return to you. I love you. And I you, she said and kissed him again. When she reluctantly freed her lips from his, she sighed. Alarion needs to talk to you. About what? He feels the pull north too. And this drove the blood from his face. No. Yes, she said gently. He came to me this morning. And he is packing even as I speak. He insists on going with you. He pulled a face and then glared at the northern sea. My blood sings in his veins. I wish it did not. Our son loves you very much, she sighed. Besides, he says that he might see the other half of the family there. He has always wondered. Oh, he laughed, I admit that I would love to see the face of my brother if he met my son. If he even still lives, the black-hearted scoundrel. Very well. They strode down the seashore for a longest time, unwilling to part from each other for as long as possible, until they finally turned and made it back to the hall that was still unfinished because of his always changing plans. Their children were waiting there. Little Darian, 3 years old now and starting to turn into as headstrong a boy as his twin sisters, Dasha and Illa, tall pale Tasha and then Alarion himself. He was standing there, still, composed, his hands behind his back and his dark blonde hair as messy as ever. He stood a little straighter the moment that he saw his father, and then she caught his eye and nodded slightly, and something seemed to pierce that composure. Relief. Her husband looked at them all, placed a hand on Alarion's shoulder and nodded at him before then kneeling before in front of the others. I am called North, you know that, don't you? They nodded with various degrees of understanding. Darian nodded because the others did so as well. The girls looked at him sadly. And Alarion, well, he stood ready. I will return. I promise you that. I and your brother will return to mother and you and our home. You have my promise. And I always keep my promises. And then their crying children hurled themselves at him and he hugged them long and hard. Matters moved swiftly after that. Her husband liked to move quickly and pack lightly, and besides, as he said with a smile, the summer isles lacked the kind of clothes that they would need in the north. In Westeros. It was not until she saw him stand before the far wall of their bedroom and then slowly take down the cloth-wrapped shape that was on the shelf that she started to lose her composure. I thought that you would take that. He turned to her and smiled hesitantly. I paid a heavy price for it, he said as a hand rose and then fell from his eye patch. Then he hefted it. But in the finding of it I also found you, so it reminds me both of the curse of duty and the joy of love. Besides, Alarion will need someone to teach him how to wield it one day. She nodded, the tears falling down her face, and then he was with her, folding her into his embrace. I will come back. You know that. I have given my promise to you. And I always keep my promises. She cried as she hugged him back, hot and bitter tears, and he cried too. But when they broke their embrace he looked at her and then kissed her again. Send word to me when the babe comes. Babes, she laughed. They are twins, I feel it. They kick enough for it. He looked at her and then grinned, looking as roguish as ever. Then send word to me when the babes come. I will go first to Dawn and then take ship to White Harbor. I will write as often as I can. Alarion too. The grin faded a little. The North calls me, wife. It sings in my blood. The Stark needs me in Winterfell. I wonder what my brother thinks of such a call, if he still lives. Probably such humiliation as I can ever imagine. They sailed on the next tide and she stood there and waved until her husband and son were no more than a dot on the horizon. Tasha stood next to her, silent and red-eyed. They will return, won't they, mother? She placed a hand on her belly. Never doubt that, she said fiercely. Your father made a promise. And he always keeps his promises. A bit like he pays his debts. Robb. As he walked down the corridor, his mind was on other things. So very many other things. Things that he had done wrong the first time around, and that if it came down to again he would differently. Not that much would, not this time. Things were so very different this time. Theon was different for one thing. He seemed less boastful and more thoughtful than before, and he had even seen him reading a few books, which was not very like the old Theon that he knew. Father had talked to him, he knew that, but about what exactly he knew not. What he did know was that Theon was different. For one thing, he seemed to be spending some time in the Godswood. Not praying, not meeting anyone, just sitting and staring at the heart tree. And then there was John, who was not going to the wall, not going to throw his life away in what might have been a futile attempt to defend the wall from the others. No, this time it would be different. He would keep his brother close to him, as had always been the case in Winterfell. No matter what Mother said, although she had been a little more forgiving when it came to John these past few weeks. He frowned slightly. Why? Had Father said something to her? He walked up a short flight of stairs and then knocked at the door. Hearing a command to enter, he opened it. Inside he found Maesters Lewin and Eamon, sitting at a table that was now covered in books, documents, pieces of paper, and above all the rolls of parchment and skin from the secret room. You wanted to see me, Maesters? We did indeed, young Robb Stark, Eamon said almost cheerily. We have need of your young eyes for a start. Mine are quite inadequate, as they no longer work, and Lewin here is struggling a little. Indeed I do, my eyes are not what they were, Lewin sighed as he put down a piece of parchment. Much of the ink has faded badly, and your Lord Father has ordered me to start making as many copies as possible. We cannot risk the loss of any other information. Eamon said grimly, too much has been lost already. And yet there is still so much that we do not understand. These parchments, some of them seem to be copies of records that have long been lost by Castle Black. Which disturbs me greatly. Where could they have gone to? There was a short silence. Lost, I fear, Lewin said sadly. Who knows what was lost when so many of the castles on the wall were abandoned? Who knows what might lay in the night fort? Rooms such as the one here in Winterfell, rooms with information. And things that are now no longer understood. Robb nodded. Then let us look into what we have here, Maesters. What do you want me to look at first? And so they started off on a voyage through time, looking through old parchments that looked as old as Winterfell in places. Robb found it more than a little eerie, to read the words of men long since dead and buried. More often than not the parchments mentioned deliveries to the Night's Watch, or descriptions of things to be noted. Which of course brought up a few problems. We have no context for these documents, Maester Eamon sighed. All too often they refer to things that the Starks of old, or the Night's Watch took for granted. That last document referred to the usual delivery from the last hearth. They obviously knew what they were referring to. We, sadly, do not. This is most vexing. I feel as if we are viewing a map, but that we cannot read the names of the places on it. Something tickled at the back of Robb's mind, but he put it to one side when he realized that he couldn't quite place it. Instead he moved on to the next one, which was an old skin with the writing very faded indeed. Pulling it close he squinted at it and read it carefully. After a moment he frowned. Maesters, listen to this. Whynyr Stark did arrive at Castile Black, he did inspect ye armory and wrote Roth Whyn he did view ye weapons, crying that they were of steel and not glitter glass, as was told in ye rules handed down from ye time of heroes. But ye Lord Commander did say that ye peoples north of ye wall did vex them and that steel was needed. He looked at them. The old Night's Watch didn't use steel, they used this glitter glass, whatever that is. Why would they do that? Unless they needed it to fight the others. Lewin nodded thoughtfully and then went scrabbling through the records. Wait, there was another reference, here, yes. And Whyn ye Lord Commander asked why there were shards of stone in ye armory, he was told that, and the rest of the record is too faded to see. Humph. Robb, can you look at this? Robb took it and then peered at it. Yes, it was very faded. I take it that all these records will be copied out again. Both Maestas nodded and he quirked a smile before looking back at the piece of parchment. Was told, that, they were, from, olden times, but, that, the armorer knew not, why they, were there. There was a short silence. Weapons to use against the others is my guess, Robb said slowly as he put the pieces together. Then he turned and looked at the little pile of arrowheads to one side, before picking one up. This is stone and it glitters. What is it made from? Obsidian, Lewin said slowly. Which is also known as dragon glass. It can be found in old volcanoes. It's all over Dragonstone, Eamon breathed. His sightless eyes were moving from side to side, as he was obviously in the grip of deep thought. A stone born out of heat, and such a heat. Born from the bowels of the earth. Born from fire. And with the others linked so closely to the far north and the ice there. Fire beats ice. The stone affects the others. Robb blurted, suddenly excited. The siege of the glittering crag, which became the last hearth. There are no volcanoes in the north that I know of, but if the place was an old volcano, like an older version of Dragonstone. We have a weapon, Maester Eamon said with a grim intensity. We have something that can be used to fight the others. And that, my friends, is something that we must pass to Castle Black at once. We will need more obsidian and we will need to train the Night's Watch in its use. And they will resist that. Robb and Lewin both stared at the old man. Why? Robb asked eventually. Why? Because they are used to their swords. Their steel swords. I cannot imagine Alisa Thorne, the master-at-arms at Castle Black, taking well to being told that he needs to train the men to use stone weapons against the others. He is a humorless man enough as it is. And besides, there is another problem. We have these arrowheads, but they are a drop in the ocean to what we need. Can you say that every arrow will find their mark? And if they work against the others, do they also work against whites? The records say naught about that. Will we need steel against whites, but obsidian against the others? Can we create obsidian daggers? Or swords? From I remember the stone is sharp but also can be brittle. He smiled slightly. We have made a good start, but we have far to go. Young Robb, you have a good head for war on your shoulders. You can see the difficulties, can you not? Robb thought the matter through. I can, he agreed. Maestas, I must bring this to my Lord Father. And also Lord Umber. He will know what stones can be mined at the last hearth. And if need be, Father can send a raven to Stannis Baratheon and ask for obsidian from Dragonstone. He stood and left quickly, striding down the corridor with urgent steps. And as he did, he found himself looking in the direction of the woods yet again. The pull was growing stronger. The direwolf that would birth Grey Wind was getting closer, he could feel it. And then he broke into a run. He had the feeling that they were starting to run out of time. Jon Arryn. Lysa was still coldly furious with him. However, he cared not a whit. He had known, instinctively, that it had been the right thing to do, that sending his son away from King's Landing was the only thing to do. His wife had not taken it well, had cried and screamed and then shouted hysterically that without her young sweet Robin would die, that only she could take care of her baby, that only she loved him. And there had been a look of such hatred on her face that he was quite taken aback and had ordered her confined to her rooms until she recovered her balance. Which had taken some time. Although she had finally warmed a little recently, after Baelish had begged to have a word with her. Jon had breathed easier once word had arrived that young Robert had reached White Harbor, although he admitted that he would not truly relax until Ned sent word that the boy had arrived safe and sound at Winterfell. And why had Lord Marndale sent so large an escort with them? He tapped a finger against the side of the window that he had been staring out for the past few minutes and then shrugged internally. He had no answers, and besides he had a meeting of the small council to attend. When he reached the room he was unsurprised to find Stannis Baratheon there. He was invariably early for such meetings, as if he had an internal sundial. Robert had once actually said that, only he had been far more colourful in his terminology. My Lord Hand, the Master of Ships said, standing and bowing slightly. Lord Baratheon, Jon replied with a bow of his own. There was no one else there, but Jon knew that it would not do to mention the great matter there. He had his suspicions about the place. Too many dark corners, too many cornices, too many fireplaces. Too many potential ears. And yet the great matters of the kingdom were discussed here. Who listened to what and reported to who? Oh, this terrible game they all played, this Game of Thrones. Hearing feet, he turned to the passageway to the right. Pycelle, unless he missed his guess, judging from the shuffling gait. And sure enough, it was the old Grand Maester, clutching something in his hand. A message. My lord hand, the older man puffed weakly, his wattles jiggling a little. A message from his grace the king. And a passing strange one too. John frowned and took the proffered piece of parchment. Well, it was certainly written in Robert's hand. It was near illegible, meaning that he had either been extremely drunk or incredibly excited when he had written it. Staying at Storm's End for a few more days. Have found lost Durandon relic. Lost Durandon tombs too. Robert, King of Westeros, etc., etc., etc. Yes, passing strange was one way to put it. He handed it over to Stannis, who looked at it with a deepening scowl. Lost Durandon relic? Stannis asked with as much incredulity as Jon thought he was capable of expressing. What nonsense is this? Lost Durandon tombs as well? Preposterous. I know that castle like the back of my hand. I grew up there and I was besieged there. There are no lost tombs there that I know of. Just the Baratheon ones. And yet that is what his grace claims. Well, we must wait for his return. The sound of slippered feet could be heard approaching, and Varys appeared. A Varys who looked as puzzled as he ever appeared. Seeing the others, he seemed to smooth his countenance and bowed slightly to them all. My lords, Grand Maester Pycelle, I trust that you are all well. Stannis, whom Jon knew loathed the spider, nodded shortly before returning to his seat. Well enough, he grated. Better once the king returns from Storm's End. Varys nodded and then fluttered his hands a little as he himself sat at the same time as the others. Has any word of his grace arrived? His trip to his ancestral home was somewhat precipitate. Here, grunted Stannis as he handed over the message. See what you make of that. The Master of Whispers looked at the parchment, seemed to reread it and then looked up, his brow furrowed. Durandon relic. Durandon tombs. I was unaware that such things existed. They don't, Stannis ground out as he looked at Varys. We'll have to wait and hear what he found, but I know nothing of any such things ever even being suspected there. There was a short pause whilst Varys seemed to absorb that information. That would fit in with the odder snippets that my little birds have brought me on this day, he muttered. Which have been odd indeed. I see that this meeting of the smaller version of the small council has already started, a voice said to one side, and Petyr Baelish swept in to take his place at the table, placing his book of accounts down to one side. What word of the king? Varys passed the parchment down. The Master of Coin squinted at it and then looked up. Relic. Tombs. At Storm's End. I am sure that his grace will enlighten us when he returns with Lord Renly, Jon said, taking charge of the meeting. Now, Varys, you said that you had odd information. The eunuch nodded. Apparently there has been a great meeting between the Brackens and the Blackwoods at the Red Fork, 50 miles east of Riverrun. Aho. Baelish chuckled, another attempt at a truce. How many died this time? A dozen. A score. Those two families will hate each other until the end of time. But Varys greeted this with a slight clearing of the throat. Actually, Lord Baelish, not one man died. They seem to have met and discussed most seriously an end to the enmity between the two houses. And then they, swore a great oath to, protect the land against, he wound down. Against. Jon prompted gently as they all stared at the eunuch. Against the others, Varys finally said, looking around the table. My little birds were very exact on that term, because I questioned it. Oddly enough, it was Pycelle who first spoke next. Preposterous. The others are but a northern myth. Ah, Lord Varys, I fear that your little birds have led you astray, Baelish said with a slow shake of his head. The others. Rank madness. Normally I would agree with you, Varys said with more than a little hauteur, if it were not for my other news. From Essos I hear that the Sellsword Company, the Company of the Rose, are seeking passage across the narrow sea. Apparently they claim that their time of exile is over. Time of exile. They are hardly Westerosi anymore, they are the descendants of those that would not bend the knee to the Targaryens when they obtained the surrender of the North. Stannis exclaimed. Why would they want to return? Who is paying them? Apparently no one. Varys said quietly. It is most confusing. Then it is my turn to add to the confusion. Jon broke in. I have had word of two most peculiar things. The first is from the Vale. Apparently some days ago the leaders of the mountain clans appeared before the Bloody Gate. All 10 of them. This seemed to stun Baelish, who as a Vale Lord knew how bizarre this news was. Impossible. All 10. All 10, Lord Baelish, and you know how likely that is. Not even a little, Baelish muttered. Then he looked at him, his eyes narrowed. What did they want? Apparently to say that they will return. That the Uri should not think that their absence means that their battle for their old rights has been suspended. Absence, my Lord Hand? Varys asked, his eyebrows heading upwards again. According to the Blackfish, Sir Brynden Tully, who was at the Bloody Gate, the mountain clans said that they are going to the north. That the others have returned, and that they are heeding some kind of call. He looked at their faces. Had this news come from anyone else than the Blackfish, I would have thought them mad. However, he is reliable. Another silence. Pycelle broke it. Preposterous. But it sounded weak. Grand Maester Pycelle, Jon said eventually. Is it true that the citadel at Old Town has announced that the glass candles can now be relit? The joggle of the Wattles gave them all their answer before the wretched man said another word. I have sent a raven back to the citadel, he said eventually. Asking them to confirm that message. As it is insane. Magic has gone from this world. Jon looked around the table. And then he saw that Varys was pale and trembling, his eyes on something that no one else could see. Lord Varys. Are you well? The others looked at the eunuch as well, who finally noticed that he was being stared at and offered them all a weak smile. Your pardon, my lords, he said shakily. Bad memories. Talk of magic brings on bad memories. Perhaps, Pycelle wheezed, you might need bloodalting, my Lord Varys. Yes, looking at you I can see that your humors are out of balance. The eunuch shot a dirty look at the Grand Maester. My humors, Grand Maester, are exactly where they need to be and do not need correcting with a bloodalting. Pycelle leant back in his chair and humphed with disgust. You know nothing about modern medicine, he muttered. Plus I have a new bloodalting device. With 6 blades. If I may return to the purpose of this meeting, Jon broke in. Grand Maester, the messages about the glass candles have gone out to every major house in Westeros and even some of the free cities by now. I hardly think that it can be a mistake not without having been corrected by now. Pycelle seemed to slump a little in his chair at this, whilst Varys closed his eyes for a long moment, but then reopened them as he seemed to rally. What would you have us do, my Lord Hand? The eunuch asked the question in a very steady voice. Something bizarre is happening and we need to find out exactly what. And the king will soon be returning from Storm's End, so that we can get to the bottom of what he found there. In the meantime we still have to ensure the smooth running of the realm. And so they plunged back into the business of the realm, Baelish with his woeful accounts, Pycelle with his expostulations about the health of the city, and then Stannis with his growled update on the current state of the royal fleet. As he watched them all, Jon wondered about them. Stannis was the one man he could trust. Pycelle seemed to have ties to the Queen, thank the gods she was not present, although Pycelle would soon relay what they had discussed back to her, and Baelish, well, he was still having doubts about the man. Yes, he was very skilled at finding revenue in the most unlikely places, but he seemed to be, well, far too amused by things. As well as on no one side but his own. That said, something seemed to be worrying the smooth little man a little today. There were small, tiny indications, a tap of a finger on the table, a look at the window occasionally. What could be wrong? Jon shrugged a little internally. He knew not. They ran through the meeting, and then as they went their separate ways a man in Baratheon livery appeared out of a doorway to one side and then silently bowed to Stannis and passed on a piece of paper. Stannis took it silently, nodded and then looked around them. It was just Jon, Stannis Baratheon and the messenger. Sir Davos Seaworth has returned, Stannis muttered quietly. and he requests an urgent and most secret meeting with us both. Renly. He sat on the low wall and looked about Storm's End. Robert was training Edric again on the grass sword, showing him the best way to keep his balance when he swung his warhammer, how to move his feet, what to look for in the eyes of an opponent. The boy was drinking in every word with a slight frown of concentration. Now that Robert was clean-shaven again that day, it was as if he was instructing a miniature version of himself. Renly suppressed a slight wince. Oh, the boy was having an impact on his father. Hopefully Robert wouldn't do something stupid and take him back to King's Landing with him. Cersei would not like that at all. In fact, the bitch queen of Casterly Rock might view the boy as a direct threat to Joffrey. He thought about the other lad for a moment. Joffrey looked nothing like Edric. Come to that, he looked nothing like Robert. But then he himself looked little enough like Stannis, so you could never tell with the way the family tree twisted its branches. That said, he almost wished that Edric was legitimate. He was a nice boy, far nicer than that little monster Joffrey. Renly looked north for a moment and then scowled a little. Yes, he was feeling it too. It seemed to be stronger here in Storm's End. What it was of course another matter. He just felt this pressing need to be somewhere further north than he was at this time. Judging by the way that Robert and Edric would occasionally look north as well, they felt the same thing. He wondered if Stannis felt it and then dismissed the thought of their brother actually trusting in a non-rational instinct. Hearing voices to one side, he looked over to see the Castellan and the Maester stroll past, deep in conversation. Penrose had carefully searched the catacombs that no one had even known even existed again, and it looked Jon had found something. He strolled over and as he approached the two saw him and bowed respectfully. So what's the latest discovery? Renly asked with a smile. My lord. Jon replied, or rather gabbled a little from excitement, I have found a reference in the archives. It seems that after word came of the last storm and the death of Argilac the Arrogant, there was a short pause before Ois Baratheon arrived here at Storm's End, and whilst Argella waited for him in defiance, having proclaimed herself the Storm Queen, she gave orders that her father's things be put away safe for another day. Now, Every thought that such words merely referred to her father's personal possessions, but what if they did not? He thought this over and then nodded. Yes, but wait. Didn't her own garrison rebel against her and hand her over to Ois in chains? Penrose said quietly. But what if that was all a mummer's farce? To hide the relics and the tombs and anything else, they made it look as if there had been a riot and a rebellion against Argella. Renly stroked his chin thoughtfully. That would make sense, he muttered. Has anything else been found there? The other two men looked at each other, before the Maester nodded slowly. I have translated the runes around the statue, he said quietly. The sword is Stormbreaker. The legendary sword of Duran God's grief, or so the legends say. The hairs on the back of his neck rose up and he shivered a little, before looking over at where the sword was resting, on a table, wrapped in a cloak, with Sir Barristan Selmy watching over it. The sword fascinated him. But then that was unsurprising, it fascinated everyone who saw it. That is, everyone that Robert allowed near it. His brother was as transfixed by their ancestral sword as anyone else. And oddly enough, it was Sir Barristan Selmy who seemed the most fascinated by the tombs of the Durandons. Although the statue troubled him, he did not blame the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. The statue troubled him too. The sight of those stone eyes burning red and that terrible voice speaking, telling Robert to go north. Thank you, he said quietly, dismissing the two, and then he strode over to the table and the old Kingsguard, who seemed to have one eye on the sword and the other on Robert. Sir Barristan. My lord, the older man said with a respectful nod. His Grace seems to be enjoying his training session with his son. Renly looked over to the two, where Robert was now crouched at the same level as Edric, adjusting his stance a little. Both had almost identical brilliant smiles on their faces. The art of the Warhammer, Sir Barristan. Naught else like it for my brother. Although I do think that he will soon be pressing to learn how to wield this weapon. He already has, Selmy said with a slight grimace. Very early this morning, I am told. I saw you talking with Sir Courtenay and Maester Jon. Is there any further news about the catacombs? Apparently the sword has a name. Stormbreaker. Selmy blinked hard at this. Gods be good, he breathed. Do we really live in a time where legends come alive again? My ancestors fought for the Storm Kings, and Stormbreaker was said to be a mighty weapon. No one has seen it for many centuries though. You saw the statue, Sir Barristan Renly said quietly. You saw it. Selmy's head dipped for a long moment. I did, he said softly. And suddenly I have doubts. About the seven. Something calls to me, my lord. I cannot say what. Some part of me that has the blood of the first men, some part of me that wishes that there was a Godswood here. Strange to think that I should have such thoughts now. Renly. Sir Barristan. Robert was striding towards them now, as Edric continued to practice his swings. What do you think of him? The Kingsguard cast an eye at the lad. He swings it well, your grace. As if he was born to it. Robert said as he grabbed a mug of weak ale and then drank from it. Gods, I've got a thirst on me. And I ache like I have not for years. But 'tis good to be here again. And to spar properly. And it was true. Robert was still fat, but a little less than before, and there was an energy to him, a life that fair crackled off him like lightning. Robert, Joan had news. The sword of the Durandons, well, it has a name. His brother looked at him sharply. What name? Stormbreaker. Robert stared at them astonished. He is sure. He is sure. There was a long pause, and then Robert's face set in a look of implacable determination. Very well then. Sir Barristan. Your grace. It seems that I require training in the use of such a sword. You are the finest swordsman that I know of. Will you assist me? The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard blinked at his king for a moment, and then he nodded. With everything I have, your grace. Good, because we have little time. I was right. War does march on the seven kingdoms. Why else would we find Stormbreaker now? What gods now control our destiny? He looked over at Edric, who had stopped practicing and was now looking at them with concern. My son, where does the wind call you? The boy looked confused for a moment, and then a look that seemed to mirror his father crossed his face. North, father. North indeed. Pack your things. I am sending you and Sir Courtenay to Winterfell. You'll learn to fight there. And we. Robert looked at Renly and Selmy, the latter looking as if he had heard the horns of war itself, judging by the way that he was flaring his nostrils. We are going back to King's Landing. The realm must be put in order. Jory. The moment that he caught sight of the broken tower, he let out a deep sigh of relief that he hadn't even known that he'd been holding in. Winterfell. They were within sight of Winterfell. It wasn't as if they had had a hard or difficult journey. The King's Road had been its usual self and had even been repaired in a few places, so they had made good progress. It had instead been the constant vigilance required the entire time, that need to eye any fellow travelers on the road, especially those on horseback, carefully, and also keep an eye on the tree line whenever the road went through a wood. And with every league that passed he found himself marveling over the difference in the little lordling. When they had left White Harbour he'd been riding on Anna's lap, bundled in furs and yet looking around him with an increasingly keen gaze. These past 2 days he'd been on a horse of his own, albeit one that was tied to that of one of Lord Marndalis' men. He wanted to learn how to ride. He wanted to learn how to use a bow. He wanted to learn how to use his dagger. He wanted so very many things. So no, he was not the same boy. Lord Arryn would likely not recognize him, without his pallor and the dark circles under his eyes. Instead he looked like a healthy little boy. He had not had a shaking fit for days now, and Jory stared at the trees fiercely in an effort to hide his glare of fury. How could someone do that to the child? Hearing hooves to one side he looked back to see Duncan, the man in charge of Lord Marndalis' escort, approach. Winterfell is ahead, we should prepare to enter the castle in a manner befitting the son of Lord Arryn. He nodded at that. Aye, we should. Banners to the fore if you please. He then waved at Willits and the Valyman trotted up. Winterfell approaches. We need to announce the arrival of Robert Arryn. Willits, who was a terse man of few if any words, nodded shortly and then smiled crookedly. We have a banner, he said quietly, before nodding and then riding off to talk to Rickson, who fumbled in a saddlebag. And so it was that some hours later the party clattered through the main gate of Winterfell, led by the sky-blue falcon soaring against a white moon, on a sky-blue field of House Arryn, and the white merman with dark green hair, beard and tail, carrying a black trident, over a blue-green field of House Marndale. They had of course long been seen and noted and reported on, and as they drew rein Jory could see the familiar figures of Lord and Lady Stark striding towards them. He dismounted and bowed formally to them both as they drew up to him. "My lord, my lady. I brought Robert Arryn, the son of Lord Arryn, the Hand of the King, to you. I have fulfilled my oath to Lord Arryn that I would bring him here safe and sound." Lord Stark looked at him and then nodded. "You have done well, Jory Castle.